In this video, we will be exploring the entire 8th tier of the largest unsolved mystery iceberg ever made. Unsolved murders to serial killers to missing persons, to mathematical puzzles, scientific wonders of the universe, ancient wonders of the world, cryptids, monsters, internet mysteries, paradoxes, dinosaurs hiding in the Amazon, and alien encounters, and much more. This video is a supercut of every video I made in the 8th tier, and it contains a ton of cases. As always, I've removed all the intros and outros for the videos. I've cleaned and bundled them all up into one easy to digest video. And so, with that being said, please enjoy this 8th tier of the Unsolved Mystery Iceberg. And quickly before we begin, I have word from on high that less than 20% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy these videos, please consider supporting the channel and subscribing so that you don't miss any future videos. And now, into our first entry. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is Valerian Orange Blossom and Passion Flower Tea, and yes, that's a real tea. And join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. In Tier 8, we have the 1561 celestial phenomenon over Nuremberg, which was this incredible aerial sighting that took place all the way back in 1561. And to put that into perspective, that is actually before the discovery of bacteria. But this was posted in sort of a news article or poster sort of thing back in the day. And on this particular day in April, it tells the story of how many men and women saw this apparent aerial battle, in the sky. And obviously this was long before the invention of any aircrafts or airplanes. And the objects that are described are this large black triangular object. There were also tons of strange circles, crosses, tubes, all just flying around, bouncing around, until eventually, over roughly an hour of this, some of these objects started to kind of fall down, crash down, and apparently land on the ground in puffs of smoke. Now, I'm sure at the time they didn't really think that these were aliens. I mean, a few people might have done, but the idea of aliens from space wasn't as popular in those days. But they did probably think that this was a work of God. As it says in the news post, whatever such sign means, God alone knows. Although we have seen, shortly one after another, many kinds of signs on the heaven, which are sent to us by the Almighty God to bring us to repentance, we are still, unfortunately, so ungrateful that we despise such signs and miracles of God. One potential explanation for this might have been something like a sundog, which is this super cool natural phenomenon where the sunlight kind of splits in two like this. But even this doesn't fully look like what happened, or at least what was described at the time. And it also doesn't explain the large black triangular object, or even the crosses or spheres or tubes. And so the mystery of what was actually seen above the sky in Nuremberg on that day some 500 years ago is still a mystery. The 1980s Franciscan priest murders. So these were the unsolved disappearances and murders of two priests in America in the 1980s. And these two were technically unconnected. They happened 2 years apart. They happened in two separate states in America, one in New Mexico and one in Montana. But the similarities between them have led some people to believe that they were in some way connected. And so this began on August 5th, 1982, where the cathedral that Father Reynold John Rivera worked in Santa Fe, this cathedral received a phone call from someone that went by the name Michael Carmelo. And he said he was calling up from the side of the road. He said he had his grandfather with him who was currently dying, and he wanted a priest to come out and read his last rites to his grandfather. And last rites are basically like the talk or the speech that a priest gives to someone who's dying, just before they die. And it should also be noted here that Father Rivera wasn't even the first person to answer the call. Originally, when this guy called, Father Gerard actually picked up, and he was given the same story, to come out and give the last rites to this guy's grandfather. But Father Gerard said he was too old, his eyesight wasn't, great, so he didn't want to be driving at night. So he said, call back in a few minutes and there'll be another priest to take the call. And so he did. Father Rivera answered the call, and then he left the cathedral to go meet this man, and he was never seen again, at least not alive. He was soon reported missing, a search was started, and he was eventually found in a muddy field just a few miles away from where the man asked him to meet. He had been shot in the stomach, strangled with some sort of wire or coat hanger or something, and just left there lying in the field. His car was later found 110 miles away in a obviously completely different rest stop, and the car had been noticeably cleaned, wiped down for prints, for evidence sort of thing, and the gas tank was completely empty. And one of the only notable missing things was actually Father Rivera's last rites kit, which is very strange because if this was a robbery, you'd expect maybe more things to be missing. But if this wasn't a robbery, why would someone take something as insignificant as this? Unless the father had hit the guy with the rights kit, and so maybe it had some of his DNA on it. But that is just complete speculation. It could have been anything, as we don't actually know where the rights kit is. Then, 2 years after this, Father John Kerrigan, who had been recently transferred to this parish in Montana, he was settling in, he was getting used to it, he'd only been there 2 days. And then on the night of July 20th, he was out doing some late night jogging, he visited a bakery, he was talking to some of the locals, and then just seemingly vanished. He didn't turn up for his mass the next day, and soon after this, he was reported missing. So a search was soon started. They eventually found some of his clothing, which had been bloodied, and a coat hanger by the side of the highway, which is one of the similarities with the other case, where police thought that whoever attacked Father Rivera might have actually used something like a coat hanger to strangle him. And a week later, they found Kerrigan's car abandoned in the middle of nowhere, but Kerrigan himself was never found. Now, the two car scenes for these two cases were honestly almost day and night. As I mentioned before, Rivera's car was super clean, or as clean as a crime scene could be. You know, the killer made an effort to kind of wipe it down, sanitize some things, clean some of the blood, clean some of the prints, but Kerrigan's car was an absolute mess. It looked like some sort of struggle had taken place. There was all blood inside the car, and when they popped open the trunk, they found more blood, and they also found Kerrigan's wallet with over $1,200 of cash. And obviously the wallet wasn't taken, so whatever the motive here was, it almost certainly wasn't financial. Some people have suggested that these cases were connected to some strange underhand dealings of some kind, and so the phone call was initially kind of a secret message sort of thing, and when the priests went out to meet whoever they were meeting, maybe the deals ended up falling through, and so the people they were dealing with ended up killing them in order to basically silence them. This theory has very little proof or evidence supporting it, but there's very little proof or evidence for these cases to begin with, which I think is what makes them such big mysteries. We don't know who killed these men, we don't know why. You know, perhaps they were just two unrelated, unmotivated killings, which that might actually be worse, because then we're dealing with two mysteries, or they are the work of serial killers or just random drifters that happen to hate the church for some reason. And Rivera, as far as we can tell, was a good priest. You know, he was great to his community, he was well loved, he had no convictions or funny business or anything like that, again, as far as we can tell. But Kerrigan, on the other hand, he was not upstanding, to say the least. As I said earlier, he had just moved to the area that he went missing from 2 days ago, and it was much later on in 2015, during a settlement between some abuse victims and between the church, that the church ended up releasing by court order over 80 names of members of the church who had been convicted or suspected of misbehavior, shall we say, with minors. And lo and behold, Kerrigan's name was on there. He had moved around quite a bit over the last few years and had actually been assigned to 13 parishes over the past 30 years. So he clearly wasn't a great person, to say the least. And this has led some people to believe that the cases actually weren't connected, and Rivera's killing might have been just a random hitchhiker or a random crazy person or someone who hated the church in general, and Kerrigan's killing might have been from either a victim or a relative of a victim who had seen or experienced what Kerrigan had done and ended up tracking him to this little parish and, taking the law into their own hands, which I don't think is a terrible theory. But those are where both cases currently sit today. They're both open cases, they're both suspected of maybe being connected, but not confirmed, and they are both still unsolved. Active Enterprises unreleased games. So this is a super fun case, especially for people who like older video games. And AVGN, one of my favorite creators of all time, or at least his earlier videos, but he actually covered the games Action 52 and Cheetah Man 2, which were two of the worst games ever created and were both created by Active Enterprises. They were active, if you'll pardon the pun, making games between 1989 and 1994. And after Action 52 was released, there were actually genuine solid plans to create this entire standalone handheld game console, the Action Game Master. And this game console would have had its own entire line of games, and it would have been compatible with the NES, with the SNES, and with the Sega Genesis through these special adapters. And it would come with, as you see here, a battery charger and a plug for the cigarette lighter in your car, in case you want to charge it on the go. So a pretty nifty little device, with really only one problem. It never actually existed, at least as far as we can tell. Active Enterprises attended the 1994 Consumer Electronics Show in Nevada, and they showcased, as well as this console, they showcased a third Cheetah Man game, as well as loads more ideas and products and future projects. There was a game just called Sports 5, which sounds exciting, as well as a port to this handheld console of the original game Action 52. So they had all these plans and ideas and planned games and maybe consoles, but that was basically the end of Active Enterprises. They never made anything past 1994. The console was never developed or released. None of the games were ever released. And it's unknown at what stage they stopped developing. Were there any prototypes made for the console or for the games? Are there some basic, rudimentary cartridges out there with perhaps some alpha versions of these games? Does a physical prototype of the console exist somewhere out there? And if so, where is it and who has it? Or were all of these things just theoretical on paper, and when the company ceased to exist, so did these products? Maybe we'll solve this mystery one day when someone comes out or someone finds something, but until that day, this case remains a mystery. Alexander Litvinenko was, well, you may have heard about him over the last 20 years or so, but he was a former officer of the Russian Federal Security Service who basically ended up leaving Russia, moving to the UK, and working as a journalist, as a writer, as a researcher against Putin and against Russia. What basically happened was in 1998, Litvinenko and a few others accused their higher-ups in the Federal Security Service, or the FSB for short, of basically being corrupt and of ordering the assassination of a man named Boris Berezovsky, who was basically this very rich businessman, government official. And for this accusation, Litvinenko and a few others were officially charged by Russia, and they were charged with, and I quote, exceeding the authority of their positions. This trial went back and forth for a while before eventually being dismissed in the year 2000. But after this, Litvinenko kind of saw the corruption in Russia at the time, and he didn't want anything more to do with it. He fled to the UK, was eventually granted citizenship there, and as I said, worked as a journalist, as a writer, and as a consultant for the British government. And so after being in the UK for many years and reporting on assassinations, on organized hits, on corruption, Litvinenko went to meet a man named Mario Scaramella, who was a professional acquaintance and friend of Litvinenko's, and he said he had some important information on the assassination of Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who was shot dead in her apartment only 3 weeks before this, which might have been another paid hit by the Russian government. So the two met up in a sushi place in London, they had lunch there, and then suddenly Litvinenko fell ill. So he was immediately taken to hospital. They did many tests on him and eventually found that he had ingested this insanely rare, insanely potent, powerful poison, and this poison was in the form of this highly radioactive substance, radionuclide polonium-210, and he likely consumed this earlier on in the day when he met up with these two former Russian agents, and he met up with them in this hotel lobby, had some green tea, had a little bit of a meeting, and it's thought very likely that his green tea was actually spiked with this polonium. And then he drank the tea, and from the moment that he sipped that T, he was basically a dead man walking. And polonium-210 is one of the most insane substances I've ever read about. A gram of this, a single gram, is enough to kill 50 million people and to poison a further 50 million. They estimate that Litvinenko consumed around a millionth of a gram of this stuff, and that was enough to kill him in a few weeks despite the best help from all of the doctors. But despite polonium-210's insane potency, it is actually incredibly easy to transport and to handle. It can be kept quite easily in just a simple plain glass jar, and it won't actually penetrate the glass walls. And you can even technically handle it, hold it, although I wouldn't recommend it, but it's only really deadly if it gets into your system. So that's whether you breathe it in, whether it gets through an open wound, or whether you obviously consume it. And it doesn't even trigger or set off any radioactive alarms in like airports and stuff. So yeah, insanely deadly and potent, worryingly easy to transport around and through borders. And as I said, Litvinenko consumed some of this and he fell ill and eventually died 3 weeks later. Now, who exactly was responsible for this is still technically an unsolved mystery. Like, it's kind of a safe bet that these two former Russian agents were in on it in some way, as they were there in the hotel, and when they went in with detectors to detect radiation levels, they found that the hotel bathroom had like an absurd amount of radiation in. So clearly they had taken it out, prepared something in there. But these Russian agents flew back to Russia, and when Britain requested an extradition of these agents, you know, for coming into their country and murdering one of their citizens, Litvinenko, Russia basically said, you know, we would love to send you these people, but sadly it's in our constitution that we can't extradite Russian citizens. Like, look, I would love to help you out. It's written right there in the constitution. My hands are tied. Nothing I can do. And that was basically it. People suspected that the Russian government or Russian Secret Service or Putin was behind this hit. And, you know, it would kind of make sense with Litvinenko making enemies of Russia and leaking some of their secrets and reporting on some of their corruption. It would make sense that Russia would want to put some sort of an end to this. And at first, when he was brought into the hospital, the doctors thought it was perhaps lithium poisoning, as you don't just immediately jump to polonium-210 poisoning, you know, as a diagnosis. It is insanely rare. Only one person has been poisoned with something like this ever, and that was Litvinenko. But someone eventually had a hunch, they did some tests for it, and yeah, it came back positive for polonium-210, but who exactly officially is responsible for this killing, and obviously why, is still, officially at least, an unsolved mystery. The Amazonian humpback whale. So this was this huge 8-meter long, 6-meter wide whale, which is 26 feet by 19 feet for people who don't use meters. But this whale was found dead, washed up 15 meters from the sea in the Amazon. And while humpbacks do travel kind of somewhat in this area, it's not like their favorite spot. There's not like a ton of them here. And obviously the mystery of how exactly it came this far inland is still unsolved. People were suggesting that maybe the whale had died actually in the water, and then large tides washed it up, brought it onto the shore, and, you know, 15 meters into the shore. Or perhaps since it was a younger whale, it had been swimming maybe a little too close to the shore, and then these tides rapidly came in, the whale didn't, you know, swim away fast enough, and so it got flushed in with the tide went out, left the whale lying there, and then it eventually died from exhaustion. But it's a pretty sad case. Poor whale. And some of the more interesting theories I've seen about this are your standard alien abduction, you know, zooped up the whale from the waters and then zooped it down in apparently the same place, but the alien messed up the GPS or something, put it slightly inland, and then it ended up dying. Like, thanks, alien. Or flying whale. Somehow it flew, landed inland, which, yeah, I don't know too much about that last theory, but it is a slightly unusual case nonetheless. American hyena sightings. So this refers to the many strange sightings of hyenas all over America over the last X amount of years, which is very strange because, as you might know, hyenas don't live in America. Like, they don't even live close. They live mostly in Africa, in the Middle East, in India, but definitely not even as far up as the American continent. Although some species of hyena did actually live in America like long ago, and there has actually been some ancient art depicting animals kind of similar to hyenas, and as I said, there have been many sightings all the way back to like 1700s of what people claim are hyenas. Now, are all of these just hoaxes? Are they illusions or mistaken identifications? Are they a strange type of cryptid or a mutated dog or wolf or something? Or are they a strain of hyena that was left over here and has maybe been hiding in woods or something, or caves, you know, from long ago? Or are these hyenas that have escaped from homes? You know, not that any sane person owns a hyena, but maybe collectors, you know, they have ostriches and elephants and hyenas in their house or a zoo or something. And then some of these, you know, escape into the wild, start breeding. There's a little tiny population of hyena. All of these are probably a possibility in all honesty, but there's one thing I think we can all agree on, and that is that hyenas look incredibly strange. The Amtrak Sunset Limited train derailment. So this was this deadly event that took place on October 9th, 1995, where this train was heading along its tracks from Miami to LA, and when traveling through Arizona, it actually became derailed just before a bridge ended up falling off the edge, and it injured more than 100 passengers and actually killed one crew member, 41-year-old Mitchell Bates. And this wasn't just some unfortunate accident. This was planned very carefully by someone who knew what they were doing, who seemingly knew how trains worked and tracks, probably knew the timetable of this train, and clearly wanted to do a lot of damage. Whoever it was came to this part of the track. They pulled out 29 of these spikes that held the rails in, and they basically shifted the tracks just, you know, slightly, so that when the train came along on top of the track, when it came to the little part that was moved, instead of carrying along on that track, it ended up getting derailed, falling off the side of the bridge, and as you might imagine, causing a lot of damage. And honestly, it was incredibly lucky that more people didn't end up dying. And normally, if you don't really know what you're doing and you go to sabotage some train tracks, perhaps you might just grab the rails, move them apart, cause some damage. But there's actually these cables that run in between the tracks, and if one of these cables is frayed or broken or disconnected in some way, that will actually send a signal back to the, you know, train headquarters and tell them, okay, there's a problem with the line at this exact point, don't drive any trains across it. But for this particular crash, even though the spikes were pulled out and the train track was shifted, the cables were left intact, meaning the train company had no idea that there was even a problem on these rails until, obviously, the derailment took place. Because as you can imagine, with a train going from Miami to LA, there are so many miles of train tracks that it would be insane to regularly physically inspect all of the train tracks. And so they thought whoever did this maybe had some knowledge about trains, train tracks, maybe they were a former driver or a former inspector or worked on the rails or something like that. So they started to look into those people, current workers, people who were fired from the train line company, or the railroad company rather. And to add to all of this, there was a fairly similar crash that happened in 1939 in San Francisco, in which a train was derailed by someone coming along and sabotaging the track. And in that one, 24 people died and 121 were seriously injured. And similar to the 1995 one, this 1939 one was also unsolved. And during the investigation for the 1995 crash, they started to look into train journals, into posts on train forums, and eventually found that in this particular train journal, which is like a weekly or monthly subscription for train lovers to read, this particular edition, which was posted out to people just weeks before the 1995 crash, actually featured a story basically explaining the 1939 crash. So the FBI started to think that maybe one of these subscribers had received the journal, they were reading through, they saw the 1939 crash and thought, yeah, that looks good. Another, and they just committed a similar attack. Or perhaps that it was the writers of the journal that had put this out, for some reason telegraphing it, teasing with people before they actually committed it. But after investigating a ton of people, both readers, writers, train enthusiasts, the FBI kind of came up empty-handed. But I think it would be kind of insane to think that the publication had nothing to do with the crash. The crashes are very similar in terms of how they were carried out, and with the publication going out just 3 weeks before this crash, they're not exactly common crashes that happen like every week. For it to be that close to the 1995 crash, I think either someone leaked that it was going to happen or someone was inspired by it in some way, which is pretty sad to be inspired by a deadly train crash, and especially to be inspired by one this deadly. It seems like both derailments were specifically planned to kill as many people as possible. They timed it kind of just after a bend, just before a bridge, so the train would fall as far as possible, and also kind of in the middle of nowhere, so that it would take emergency services even longer to get to anyone who is injured. And near the site of this crash, the FBI found this kind of printed out document leaflet sort of thing, and it was this whole letter basically saying a bunch of things, attacking the government and the police and corruption, and it was signed at the bottom, the Sons of the Gestapo. But after many years of investigation, the Sons of the Gestapo has never been proven to even exist. So they're either the most secretive underground group that also leaves open letters around. It's like, do you want to be found and acknowledged or don't you? Or it was purposefully put there by whoever did the train derailment. They just made up a ominous criminal sounding name, Sons of the Gestapo, and they left it there as kind of a red herring for the investigators. It's a very strange, sadly deadly case with very little evidence, very few if any suspects, almost no motive outside of like sheer chaos, destruction, death, and as I said, it is still unsolved to this day. The ancient Mexico lost snake statue. So the 1800s were a time of discovery, exploration, plundering, looting, cool artifacts, discoveries of ancient statues, civilizations, all really cool stuff. And one very well renowned at the time collector, William Bullock, arranged multiple exhibitions more or less showcasing the things that he had found and acquired. And in one of them, pictured here, he showcased many South American artifacts. We have the Aztec calendar or sunstone here, the statue of Coatlicue, the stone of Tizoc, and this statue of a giant snake swallowing a man that we have no idea about where it came from, where or who it was procured from, or even where it currently resides today. We're not even sure if it still even exists. It does look to be a similar style to all the rest of the artifacts, but nobody outside of this exhibition had ever seen this statue or seemingly ever saw this artifact again after the exhibition ended. There are no other references to it, no other sightings, and so maybe it was just a fantastic find that ended up getting lost or destroyed after the exhibition. Maybe it was being transported and ended up being split in half or irreparably damaged, and so they just decided to destroy the whole thing. Or maybe it was being transported at sea and ended up, falling overboard into the sea, never to be seen again. Or maybe some super rich important person bought it to keep for themselves in maybe a secret underground vault or something. But the point is, no one really knows, and this should be called the Cotton Eye statue because, where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from? Cotton Eye statue. The Australian enigma is this beast. Holy cow, that's scary. But it was said to have eyes as large as shields, and it came up out of the water and just started to, chomp at the boat and at all of its crew members, and it actually ended up killing a sailor on board. So after a while of this, the captain went down under the deck, grabbed these 2 pistols like akimbo style, and ran up to the top, fired the pistols, 1 in each eye, and the creature recoiled, being blinded, and just went back down into the water. And after this incident, it was never seen again. So whether it's just genuinely never come up to the surface again, whether it's never been seen again in that way, or whether these 2 shots to the eyes actually ended up killing it, we don't really know, but it is a very cool cryptid entry. The Bildad is this strange little creature in everyone's favorite type of lore, and that is the lumberjack folklore. And it purportedly only lives in a very specific area, and that is around Boundary Pond in northwest Maine. The Bildad is rumored to just wait around the pond, kind of nearby the water, surrounding itself with insects, and when the fishes come up to the surface of the water to eat these insects, the Bildad jumps over the fish and slams its tail directly onto the fish. And this slam is hard enough to knock the fish unconscious, and then the Bildad then proceeds to, eat the fish. And strangely enough, in this lore, apparently when you eat the Bildad, if you manage to find one, kill it, eat it, you would then start to suffer Bildad-like symptoms. And then soon after this, you would actually transform into a Bildad, which for everyone who was thinking about consuming this forbidden meat, you have been warned. BLC-1, which stands for Breakthrough Listen Candidate 1, and was a radio signal detected in 2019, coming from the direction of our nearest star and solar system, Proxima Centauri. The signal came in at 982.002 MHz, and may perhaps come from some sort of civilization in that solar system. There are theories by some that say that this radio signal might have been from our own planet. Interference within the stratosphere, radio signals bouncing around from somewhere else and then kind of making it look like it came from outer space, which is always a theory, but it was a strange signal seemingly coming from outer space, and we have no idea really exactly where it came from or who or what sent it. The Brabant Killers were a group of very, very bad men who committed an entire slew of killings, robberies, hijackings in Belgium in the early to mid 1980s. And over these 3 years, this group killed 28 people and seriously injured a further 22. They were at the time the most notorious crime group in Belgium and had members that went by names such as the Giant or Le Giant, the Killer or Le Tueur, and the Old Man or Le Vu. And I didn't research how to pronounce those names, so I'm probably comically far away from the correct pronunciation, but it was funny to try nonetheless. Now, the Giant was, well, a very tall man who was thought to be kind of the head of this entire operation. The Killer was obviously a guy that liked killing, and he ended up actually doing most of the physical killing work. That was like his favorite thing to do, I guess. And the Old Man was not even that old, so a bit rude, but he was a middle-aged man who did the majority of the driving, which they could have just called him the driver, but yeah, Old Man, I guess. And although this group had like a string of crimes, like from here to the moon, there was never actually much headway made in catching them or in figuring out who they were. And in fact, most of the recent arrests in relation to this case were of former Belgian officials and police detectives for stuff like corruption, evidence tampering, and just plain misconduct during these cases. And because this group kind of came, did their thing, and then disappeared, and because of the seeming lack of investigation into them, people have theorized that perhaps this group was actually like Belgian secret agents. Maybe they were undercover, maybe they were doing work of their own, maybe they were assassinating people on behalf of the Belgian government, or of course it was a genuine crime group and the police were just a little corrupt and fairly bad at what they were doing, which is always a possibility. But this group more or less stopped what they were doing altogether in 1995, and they just disappeared, never to be seen again. They were pretty much never identified, and the investigation into them officially ended on June 28th of this year, or in 2024 if you're watching this at a future date, so it will forever remain an unsolved case. The Bronze Age collapse is a super interesting, fascinating ancient mystery that starts off all the way back in roughly 3300 BC, so more than 5,000 years ago. And this was more or less at the start of the Bronze Age. Now, before this was the Stone Age, where most tools, weapons, that sort of thing were made out of stone. It was the easiest, most effective, most durable material to make things out of. And even though humans at the time had discovered metal and they had even begun smelting it, a lot of the metals that they had started working with were basically too soft or brittle or pliable in order to reliably make them into weapons or tools. Like you had copper, for instance, which was being worked on for around like 3,000 years at this point. But if you make a hammer out of copper and start smashing stuff with it, the copper will pretty quickly deform and or break. So they mostly use these metals for like necklaces, for decorations. But it wasn't till around 3000 BC that people in ancient Sumer, or like modern day Iraq, had the genius idea to start mixing tin with their copper. And for anyone who's played RuneScape before, you will know that this creates an alloy named bronze. So bronze is mostly copper for all intents and purposes, but when you mix it with tin, it becomes insanely more durable, stronger, and they were able to make bronze daggers, axes, spears, hammers, and so began the Bronze Age. And just as a quick aside, Sumer as a civilization was just insane. Like, they more or less invented writing and language, which was absolutely revolutionary at the time. They invented and practiced some of the earliest forms of government, and they had amazing technology, super advanced architecture for the time. So super cool civilization, but that's another entry for another day. But bronze, boy, let me tell you about bronze. And the world hadn't yet discovered iron, at least not in its optimal form. We'll get into that a little bit later. But this was the Bronze Age. And at that time, this whole area around more or less the Mediterranean, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and even parts of the Middle East and Asia. All of this was this hustling, bustling collection of civilizations. They had trade routes and agreements. They had different peoples from different places. It was, quite honestly, incredibly impressive. And there was actually this shipwreck found off the coast of Turkey that kind of reflected the diversity and collaboration between these civilizations back in the day. You know, it was a trading ship that had seemingly sunk down into the water, but it still contained on it shipments of copper from Cyprus, shipments of tin from Afghanistan, silver and gold from Greece, wood from Lebanon, jewelry from Africa, as well as a few more niche things like elephant tusks and ostrich shells, or ostrich eggshells. So in this one ship, just a fantastic diverse collection of all of these materials and wares from basically all over the world. They had writing, they had knowledge, you know, how to structure things, how to build things. They were developing quite rapidly, and actually partly how we know about all of this is because of the records that they ended up keeping. Because they had developed writing at the time, they kept records of military goings-ons, any promotions that were made, who was in charge, what battles they had, and even stuff to do with like medical and political issues. And then suddenly, within the span of only like a few decades, this entire interconnected web of advanced civilizations, you know, advanced for the time, it all just mysteriously collapsed into a new Dark Ages. Knowledge and languages were lost, some of them permanently. Huge, powerful kingdoms ended up collapsing. Chaos and violence was the new norm, and we have no idea what caused it. Most historians believe that there were at least multiple causes for this collapse, because even if there was just a single cause, it would have to be insanely dramatic and powerful to affect this many nations to this degree. Now, when you combine area-wide storms, drought, famine, perhaps a deadly plague kind of sprinkled in there, you know, something akin to the Black Death or something, and with the addition of something or some people we mentioned earlier in the iceberg, the sea people, this perfect recipe for disaster could very well have led to and spelt the end of this fantastic era. And the sea people were this huge group of mysterious kind of fighters, warriors, who all came from the sea, hence the name Sea People, but where they originated from, we really don't have any clue. They weren't this organized military from this foreign nation or anything. They were seemingly a hodgepodge of different people from different nations. They had different weapons from one another, different outfits, and they are noted in a bunch of these civilizations, notably in Egypt, as coming from the sea, attacking these nations, these kingdoms, and then either being victorious, in which case they, pillage and plunder the entire kingdom, or they are not successful and they either die there or jump back into their ships and head back into the sea. And everyone who wrote about these people at the time didn't really know where they came from. And even with all of our modern research and technology, we still kind of don't know where they came from. We think they might have been like either southern or northern European, maybe these small Celtic tribes that ended up having to come south, perhaps avoiding a plague or famine themselves. And when they came south, they found this incredibly prosperous Mediterranean area, and so to save their families, to save their peoples, they went around and attacked these nations. And it could be the plagues and natural disasters and famines, etc., that originally caused these sea people to flee their, nation or their land. That also could have spread to these Mediterranean nations. So they were dealing with a lack of water, a lack of food, maybe disease around the area, depopulation, and then to top it all off, these sea people come in and destroy basically whatever they have left. And that would make sense, at least to me, as a logical explanation. But as I said, officially we don't know what caused this collapse, and when the initial collapse started, this likely further accelerated the collapse because, ironically, of how interconnected these nations were. So say if Cyprus is attacked and ends up collapsing, well, all of a sudden there go all of the exports from Cyprus. So if another nation relies on Cyprus's copper to make bronze, this would mean this nation is able to make less weapons, less tools, and then probably limits their ability to make food. Then if another nation relies on this nation for their food, they end up having less food to feed to their miners, so they're able to mine less resources, and then you can see how this would kind of accelerate this massive collapse. And obviously this is all accelerated by the bloody sea people. But once again, I absolutely love this stuff. I love the history side of these mysteries, and it is one of the greatest mysteries outright of all time. And after this collapse, people didn't really have a ton of access to bronze, because as I said, they lost a lot of their access to either tin or copper. So they started to mess around with other metals such as iron, and ended up discovering wrought iron, which was strong and solid enough to now make into weapons and tools. And so began the Iron Age. And then eventually they discovered steel by carbonizing the iron, but that is another story for another day. The butterfly people of Joplin. So these were these strange creatures that were seen in the aftermath of the Joplin tornado in Missouri 2011. And many people in the city during the storm said that they saw these creatures that they described as butterfly people, and they were flying around either saving people or shielding people, putting their wings around someone or lifting a tree or rubble off someone that has been trapped. And honestly, they seem like pretty cool creatures. People think they might be angels perhaps, or a strange kind race of aliens, or a cryptid creature of some kind, or just a mass vision or illusion of some kind. They haven't been seen since that event, so whoever they were, whatever they were, where they came from, where they went, is still to this day a mystery. The cop killer of Harbin City. So this was a case in China between 1987 and 1988 where at least 5 policemen and their families were murdered, and these cases and the killers behind them were never solved or caught. And this all took place in Harbin City in northeast China, and the local people are apparently kind of torn on how to feel about this case. The cops that were targeted by this killer were apparently quite corrupt, and so this guy is sometimes seen as a bit of a Dexter figure or a hero in some ways, with him sometimes actually being called the Hulan hero, with Hulan being like the area that Harbin City is in. And this title or name is a little messed up for reasons we'll cover in just a bit, but people have different theories on whether he was specifically targeting cops, whether maybe he himself was a criminal or an ex-cop, or whether he was just a serial killer on the loose and for some reason targeted the specific cops. The first case took place on June 6th, 1987, where Zhang Fugui, a policeman, and his wife and his 2 children were killed after someone broke into their home with an axe in the middle of the night and started attacking them. Their other kid was seriously injured but thankfully didn't die. And yeah, already before we get into the other cases, I think the nickname of Hero is already off the table. Like, it's bad enough killing people, and maybe if they're like insanely corrupt or you're actually killing murderers, it's still illegal, but maybe some people might be okay with it. But when you start involving people's family members or especially their children, then yeah, definitely no hero. This guy is a plain psychopath. The second case involved Ma Fulin, and I will butcher some of these names, so to any of my Chinese viewers out there, I apologize in advance, but he was attacked just months after this original attack, as was his wife, as was his son, and this took place in their homes. Someone broke in, once again, with an axe, and all of this was just 300 meters away from the local security station. 2 months after this, former officer Zhu Hai was attacked, and he was shot twice while outside the home of a former police deputy, Dong Chao, who police thought might have actually been the target for this attack. Then there were 2 other policemen who were killed that year and the following year, He Ruchen and Wang Yufu, whose murders and cases were suspected to be connected to the other 3. There was also the murder of correctional officer Jia Guanzhao, who was killed at home in June of that year, and police suspect that this might also be connected to the whole series of killings. And so that's a lot of deaths of police, or at least police adjacent people, in a small enough area in just a few years in some pretty horrific ways. And there's actually very little, if any, physical evidence for these cases. A lot of it was eyewitnesses, statements, and obviously the physical crimes, the bodies, the attacks. But in terms of weapons recovered, prints, DNA, there really wasn't much that was collected. And now the current police chief says that basically everyone involved in these cases has either moved away or retired, and so as little evidence as there was to begin with in these cases, there's even less to go off now. So he thinks the odds of breaking this case, of finding who is responsible, is like slim to none. So sadly, these cases might never actually be solved, but one thing is for certain, this man was certainly no hero. Corey McKeague. So this was a 23-year-old British Air Force gunner who went missing in 2016, and he was at the time in Bury St. Edmunds, which that's a location, a town, not a command. Strange name, but it exists. But he was in town having a few drinks with friends. When the hour got later and later, he got drunker and drunker, and at around 3 in the morning, he was seen walking the streets. He walked into this little closed off like cul-de-sac area, and this area was like the back of these shops and restaurants, and so it had loads of these fairly large bins. And this CCTV footage of him walking into that area is the last time that he was ever seen. Corey was too drunk to drive, and his base was like over 2 hours walk away. So the most common theory about what actually happened to him was he was very drunk, he was looking for a place to sleep for a few hours, and so coming into this area, maybe he opened one of the bins, maybe it was full of something like cardboard, not too dirty, not really wet or damp, quite warm, and so maybe he jumped in, fell asleep. And so if this was the case, he should have just either woken up or been found in the bins, right? Well, a few days after this, he was actually reported missing. He wasn't reported sooner because I guess he was kind of known for going off, doing his own thing, being a bit of a free spirit. And so after the search started, investigators tried tracking his phone, and they traced it somewhat from roughly the area that he was last seen in, this street with all the bins, all the way along a route to a landfill. And so they did some more investigating and found that one of the lorries that had picked up bins from this area had registered a bin weight of only 15 kilos. So police thought, okay, that's probably a dead end. There's no way he was in the bin if it's only weighing 15 kilos. So they pursued other lines of investigation, other theories, but 6 months after this, it came back that the van had actually registered 100 kilos on that load, which is the perfect weight to be a tragedy. And as I said, Corey was never found. They searched the dump for the body, no Corey. They searched the bins, they searched the vans, but sadly, he never turned up. It's an extremely tragic unsolved mystery, and while there are obviously some good, some bad theories about what might have happened, at least at this current moment, this case remains unsolved. The Dominici affair involved the murders of 3 British people in France: Sir Jack Drummond, his wife Anne, and their 10-year-old daughter Elizabeth. And this all took place in 1952, and the family from Britain was in France on holiday at the time, and they were driving along Highway 96 when they stopped by the side of the road for the night, set up a tent. They were kind of camping in a lay-by sort of area, and this lay-by was near the Dominici family farm. And I won't go into the names of all of the Dominici family, but there was 75-year-old Gaston Dominici, there was his wife Marie, his son Gustave Dominici, and his wife and his child, Gaston's grandchild, as well as Gaston's brother, Clovis Dominici. And on that fateful evening, the Dominicis were celebrating. They were having a party to celebrate their good harvest, and something happened that night, and the next thing we know, Gustave Dominici, Gaston's 30-year-old son, is out on the road flagging down a passing motorist, and when they stop, Gustave tells them that he had found a dead body and needed a ride into town in order to report it to the police. And this case was honestly just all sorts of messy. The police took ages to come, and over the next few hours, neighbors came by, random people on the street came by, you had the press come in trying to look for, the next big scoop, and they were, as you can imagine, walking over basically the crime scene as this whole thing seemingly took place in the road, on the side of the road, that sort of area. And these regular people were literally just like walking around, some of them picking up sticks, looking for clues. Seemingly unknowingly, they were contaminating the evidence. Now, Elizabeth was found around 80 meters from the car, down a slope towards a river nearby the Dominici farm, with both parents, Jack and Anne, being found somewhat nearer the car, and they had both been shot to death with a rifle. And Elizabeth was also shot, but they determined her death eventually to be by bludgeoning, with likely the base or the butt of a rifle. And as I said before, this case was an absolute mess for the police and for the detectives. Evidence was being contaminated and moved. Any potential prints or marks or anything were being, stepped on and trampled by all sorts of people. And eventually the police's superiors showed up and basically reprimanded the police for creating such a bad scene. And so that's one part of the case, just the shoddy work from the police. But the other side is from the Dominici family, and just really how suspicious they ended up being. Like, for one, they seemingly couldn't keep their story straight, at all. Like, to start with, Gustave himself had a bike, so the police were like, dude, you had a bike, why didn't you just ride into town? Like, why stop a motorist to get a lift into town? So that part clearly didn't make sense. There were also witnesses and drivers and stuff throughout the night that eventually came forward. They gave certain statements, and these statements basically contradicted what the Dominici said. A few times the Dominici said they only discovered the bodies later on in the morning, but people throughout the night saw parts of the crime scene kind of changed around, and this was after the family had died, so it seemed like there was at least someone else there messing with the crime scene. There were also some of the neighbors who said they heard people in the Dominici family saying stuff like how great it was to hear this family screaming in terror all night. And then they told the police that they had only discovered Jack initially, but then later changed it to say, well, actually we discovered Elizabeth earlier on as well, but said that when they found her she was already dead, so there was nothing they could do about it anyway. And then they changed their story again, saying that when they found her she was alive, but they couldn't seem to save her. And so it was just like this back and forth, with more evidence coming in and then the Dominicis changing their story, until eventually a test was done on one of the bullets, and it was found to come from a similar carbine rifle to one that the Dominicis owned. Now, they said they didn't own this gun originally, then they later said, okay, yeah, actually we do own the gun. And Gaston's 2 sons actually later admitted to hearing Gaston drunkenly admit to the murders, and so they told the police and they basically sold him out. And then Gaston said F this, I'm gonna come clean. It's actually my sons that committed the murder, and they are trying to frame me, they're trying to set me up. But both these accusations by Gaston and by the sons eventually got retracted. So yeah, as you can tell, a lot of changes to the story, a lot to keep track of, and eventually Gaston did admit to these murders, but it was felt that he wasn't being sincere in his admission, that he was just fed up. He was going along maybe to protect his family, maybe because he was just sick of the interrogations and all that, because he was saying stuff like, when they were looking for a motive for this, they were like, why did you kill them? Did you kill them for money? And then he was like, yeah, I killed them I took thousands of francs or euros or dollars or whatever was back then. I think it was francs. But he said, yeah, I took all of their money. That's why I did it, for monetary gain, even though there was no real evidence that he had taken any money. And then they were like, was this, passionate crime? Maybe you saw the wife undressing and then, went over there. And then he was like, yeah, that's what happened. I had my way with the wife and then I murdered both of them. Even though when Anne died, she had all of her clothes on. There was no sign that she had engaged in that sort of thing recently at all. So he was clearly just an old man, completely fed up with it and wanted to get this over as soon as possible, which is why a lot of people believe that his confession is not really to be taken at face value. Eventually, he did once again retract his confession, but he was still charged with the murders regardless, and he was sentenced to death initially, death by guillotine, and then that was reduced to life, and then he was eventually released due to bad health. But there are honestly so many little details and strange things about this case that would probably take me hours to cover fully, like the fact, for example, that Elizabeth, the daughter, was likely, according to the scene, there when her parents were shot, and then tried to escape, tried to run away. She got, as I said, around 80 meters, went down this slope, and then was seemingly killed down there. But she didn't have any shoes on, and her feet were seemingly undamaged. So what, a 10-year-old girl runs through this stony road, down this stony hill path, and doesn't have a bruise on her feet, a cut of any kind? It's very unlikely, if not impossible. And on top of that, her body seemed to be warmer than her parents, which seems to suggest that she died at a later time than her parents. So there were theories saying that her parents were killed, she was captured and brought somewhere else, and then hours later she herself was killed, and then she was placed at the crime scene to try and minimize any suspicion. Another strange thing about this was originally the family said they heard no gunshots, and then they said they did hear gunshots, but they thought it was perhaps local hunters or poachers or something, and they said they heard no screams, which I guess that's possible, but you'd think that if a family was being literally shot to death just outside your farm, that they would perhaps be screaming, you would hear like something, but they apparently never did. And there were also theories that because Jack was a prominent scientist working for the government at the time, that maybe he had been a victim of these secret communist forces, this being a special hit by the USSR or something, taking down one of Britain's best scientists. Or there are also theories that Jack maybe was a undercover spy, and this was another country, maybe France, maybe the communist assassinating him. There was also the strange detail of a report of a couple who drove up to this hotel that the Drummonds had just had dinner at, and urgently asked the people there if there was an English family here, and they said, oh no, they've gone off in that direction. The couple ran back into their car and speedily drove in the direction that the Drummonds had gone. And the couple was never found or identified, and as I said, many strange things in this case. There are many who believe that the Dominicis were innocent, and they were perhaps lying because they thought they might be found guilty, and Gaston ended up eventually being like the fall guy for this. And there have been many documentaries and even a film made about this case, but what actually happened on that night and who actually killed the Drummonds is a mystery we might never come to the bottom of. Giant invertebrates. So these are a class of sea serpents created by Bernard Heuvelmans in the Heuvelmans system, and the term invertebrates basically means something without a spine or without a backbone. So in the sea, this would be stuff like squid, like jellyfish, like sponges, snails, as well as many more things, but just not stuff like whales, fishes, or sharks. So Bernard was a Franco-Belgian zoologist who was fascinated by animals, as you probably would have to be as a zoologist, but also by strange animals. So cryptid sightings, creatures, monsters of the deep. And in 1965, he decided to do some research and to write a book covering sea serpents and and went through over 500 entries dating all the way back to the 1600s. And for each entry, he put them in a certain category. These categories were long-necked, mer-horse, many-humped, many-finned, super otter, super eel, maureen saurian, which that one sounds super cool. Father of all turtles as a category. Okay, that's definitely the coolest one on the list so far. And yellow belly. And that was all of the categories until eventually later on the category of giant invertebrate was added. And this last category was kind of like a catch-all category. You know, anything that didn't neatly fit into the other categories went essentially into giant invertebrates. And this category included a ton of creatures and sightings. One sighting being the Sandy Hook serpent, which was spotted in 1963, and Marvin, which was the name given to this sea serpent that was spotted by this underwater scanning robot, Mobot the Robot, which I just love that name, in 1961. And there are a bunch more sightings, especially in this category, as I said, dating all the way back to the 1600s. And it's a fascinating topic. As I've said before, I think the sea both inspires wonder and amazement in me, as well as complete fear and terror of the deep, dark unknownness of it. And so cases like this are an absolute joy to cover, and also terrifying. The haunting of Wat Samian Nari. So Wat Samian Nari, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this is a temple in Bangkok, Thailand that dates back all the way to 1857 when it was originally built. And while it is a very beautiful temple for locals and for tourists alike, it is also rumored to be the kind of site and the home of these two female ghosts that apparently died quite a violent death many years ago. And there have been a few sightings of these women kind of over the years, both within the temple and around the temple, but some of the most interesting ones, I think, are experiences of people who have picked up these women kind of on the road, and they are often two women wearing black. They're quite quiet, they don't really talk much, and they ask to be driven to this temple. And they just tend to get in, sit in the car, the driver's making small talk, the women don't really talk, and then slowly they drive along to the temple. And apparently multiple times when they've got to the temple, whoever's driving, you know, after a few minutes or a few seconds rather, just turns around, looks for the women, and they always vanish. You know, almost as if they can walk through walls, almost as if they're ghosts. But on many occasions after these women have disappeared, they are also then seen kind of outside of the car, near, you know, the temple area. And when they're outside, they appear incredibly gruesome. You know, they're dismembered, they're covered in blood. Sometimes they're just crawling along with like the bottom half of their body, just pulling it along as well. Like, it's really some pretty gruesome stuff. And one account was of this guy who said he took up a job driving taxis, and then, you know, he picked up these women, dropped them off at the temple, and because of how they appeared afterwards, it completely terrified him. He started the car up, drove out of there as quickly as possible, and he said he basically quit his taxi job and he couldn't drive for several years because it just reminded him of how terrible it was. And honestly, I can't fully blame him. That does sound horrific. The Himatangi farmhouse fire. So this was this very tragic event that took place in 1929, and it was in Himatangi, New Zealand, and involved a farmhouse going up in flames and sadly killing 4 adults and 4 children, which would be tragic and mysterious enough as it is, except that one of the men who died, Thomas Wright, was found in the fire afterwards with a bullet hole in the back of his head, which turns this from a potential accident, maybe, you know, maybe a fire was started somehow. It turns it from that into basically a planned murder. And so obviously the next question is, what exactly happened? You know, did someone intentionally shoot Thomas and then burn down the farmhouse to cover up the evidence? Or did they have a bit of a fight with him, end up accidentally shooting him and then burn it down? Or maybe they were just originally planning to burn this down, and then maybe Thomas caught them in the act, he tried to stop them, and they needed to carry out their plan, so they ended up killing Thomas. Or was this murder carried out by someone inside the fire? You know, maybe they're fighting with Thomas, they accidentally kill him, and then they think, oh crap, I need to burn everything down, cover up the evidence. They set the fire, maybe it gets too big, they get trapped inside the fire along with all of the other people. Or was this maybe a complete stranger? You know, someone who broke into the home, tried to take stuff, tried to maybe rob the home, and then was caught, and then committed murder and then burnt down the place. It's honestly kind of hard to tell. But this particular farmhouse was like super far out of the way. Like it was kind of in the middle of nowhere, and for someone to just stumble upon it, the police thought that was quite unlikely. And there were many questions about why the person, whoever it was, ended up shooting Thomas. You know, obviously if it's a robbery, the reason is kind of clear. They did it to either attack Thomas or to defend themselves. But there were theories that came about saying that this was to do with like infidelity or something. You know, maybe Thomas was having an affair, so the wife ended up getting back at him. And there were questions like, did whoever set the fire intend to kill all of these 8 people? Or did they somehow, you know, start the fire, intend to burn down the farmhouse, but not really to kill any of the people? You know, maybe they were inside and the person who set the fire didn't know about it, or the person did know about it but kind of assumed the people would, you know, just run out as soon as the fire started. Which, to add to that, this farmhouse was kind of a death trap. Like, they literally described it as that in the newspaper. And one reason for this was because of all of the entrances and exits of the farmhouse had basically either been removed or shut or blocked off or boarded up. And I think the reason for this was that the owner of the farmhouse didn't want any burglaries. So, you know, if you've got a big farmhouse, people can kind of jump in, climb through any window. You can't really lock a window. Well, you can, but there's always, you know, ways in. So maybe after a few robberies and break-ins happened, the owner thought, all right, I'll just board up every single window, board up every single door except this like one door in the kitchen. And, you know, it's a lot easier to defend one door. And that's basically what he did. But this meant as soon as the fire started, the people were maybe trying to get out of the windows, they couldn't, and they all ended up sadly perishing. But this was all almost 100 years ago, and so we don't really have any physical evidence, much less DNA evidence, fingerprints. And while there was at least one person investigated for this crime, he was never charged or convicted. And so the reason for this crime, who did it, why they shot Thomas, why they burnt down the farmhouse, is information that we will likely never know. The Hong An murders. So the Hong An murders was an attack that happened in 2007 in Huanggang City in China, where on a cold morning just after Christmas, someone broke in or walked in or entered a small family-run lime factory. And that's this sort of lime, not this lime like I originally thought, but they broke into this factory and murdered 7 factory workers as well as 1 child with a knife, and then escaped before the police turned up. Now, the bodies were initially discovered by another factory worker who turned up for work that morning, and he just came in, entered the property, and first found his boss's wife dead on the floor with her throat having been slit. Then he slowly made his way further and further into the factory, and as he entered, he found more and more dead bodies. As I said, all having been killed with a knife. And among these factory workers were 2 who were actually husband and wife, and they had their kid living there with them, who was just 9 years old, which apparently this is quite a normal thing in China for, you know, factories like this to have some sort of dormitory for a few of the workers to live in, or at least sleep in, which they do this apparently for a whole range of reasons. 1, so they can kind of keep an eye on and have more control over their workers. 2, so that the workers can save money in rent, they can save time in travel to work. And 3, due to something called a residency card. Now, it's a bit more complicated than this, so I'll just kind of explain it briefly. But say you're living in Macau in China with your residency card registered in Macau. If you want to move to, say, Beijing, you legally have to change your residency to Beijing on the little card. And for whatever reason, apparently this is either very expensive, very difficult to do. It's not like you just submit a form, you have to do this whole legal thing. And so that has resulted in a lot of illegal workers. So it's like, yes, you can move to Beijing and you can work there, but not legally, because you can only work on Macau if your little card says Macau. So this results in a lot of people moving for work, having to work, you know, cash in hand. And also this card, as well as enabling them to work, it also enables them to put their kids through school, to book train tickets, to actually rent apartments. So if you move for work for whatever reason and you can't change the address on the card, then you're basically screwed. You can't book train tickets, you can't even rent an apartment. And so if you can find some work in another city that also offers some sort of dormitory, this kind of cuts everything out. And so, yeah, as I said, this is why it's sometimes popular in China. But this worker worker who came in that morning discovered all of the bodies. He then ended up calling the police, obviously. And when the police investigation started, they kind of determined that the attacks took place the previous evening. So they said it was between roughly like 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. But a bunch of the beds hadn't really been touched from the morning. So, the beds were still made, the bedding was still kind of laid out. So it's likely these people hadn't really gone to bed yet. So sometime probably around 8, 9, 10 p.m. is most likely correct. And there was one victim that they found a little later on, and he was outside the back of this factory, and he was collapsed in a ditch with a motorbike next to him, and he had also suffered from stab wounds. So there were some questions about this, of whether this lone man, this lone killer, actually somehow chased after this guy on the motorbike and then stabbed him. But I think it's much more likely that this man was originally stabbed with everyone else. He ended up, escaping. He got on the motorbike, he tried driving away, but he eventually succumbed to his stab wounds, and then he fell off the bike into the ditch. And he also still had his work clothes on, which again would probably put this sometime in the early evening. And one of the most strange, most terrifying parts of this investigation was the police determined that there was only a single killer. Like, based on the attacks, based on the weapon used, even based on the footprints, they said that it was likely just one guy. And I mean, the thought of just a single human being, like, I totally get that he was equipped with a knife, but like, he comes into the factory, you don't think people would start screaming, you don't think people would run everywhere. Like, to actually manage to kill 8 people before any of them actually properly get away, or before they overpower him, before they grab a piece of metal or wood and hit him, fight back. The fact that he was able to do all this is somewhat terrifying. Police also said that this man likely knew the layout of this factory, which might have helped with the actual killing. And so because of this, they were originally looking for like ex-employees that might have been annoyed by being fired, came back as a revenge. But even after offering like $7,000 or the equivalent in Chinese currency as a reward for any information to solve this case, the money has never been collected and this case has never been solved. Jangsan-pam is this creature seen in South Korea. I guess it just avoids the north, but it is described as this white sloth man dog-like creature, and it travels on all 4 feet, but unlike a sloth, it can actually travel quite quickly, which is absolutely terrifying. But I'll tell you what's even more terrifying is the fact that it can apparently imitate human speech. Like, honestly, what the hell? Can you imagine just chilling in the woods or the forest and you just hear this whispering, this like human speaking, and then no, it's this bloody Jangsan-pam creature with its stupid little 4 legs creeping up super quickly to you? Like, honestly, this is just a thing of nightmares. But it doesn't discriminate. It is also able to imitate apparently animal noises. And when it roars, it sounds, according to various people, either like a human screaming, like a train screeching, or metal scraping together, or like claws or chalk on a chalkboard, which to this creature just picked the most horrifying sounds ever. It's like a soundboard for a scary movie. It was first seen in 2010 in Busan, but it has been seen many times since then, and it is rumored to capture, kill, and eat humans whenever it finds them. Some people say it's a spirit of some kind, some say it's like an actual creature, maybe like a cryptid or an ancient old species that still exists around to this day, kind of like a sloth Bigfoot or something. But whatever it is definitely one of the creepiest things that I've ever seen. Jetpack Man. So this one's honestly kind of super fun, and this was this man, sometimes called Jetpack Man, sometimes called Iron Man, or just man in a jetpack. And this man or being was seen flying around on an unauthorized jetpack in and around LA between 2020 and 2022. And this wasn't just one sighting, this was multiple different aircrafts, multiple different pilots, crew members, all reporting live seeing this being or this man flying this jetpack at heights of up to around 1,500 meters or like 5,000 feet, which is just an insane height to be at. Just a little helmet, little jetpack, fly up to the height of airplanes. And people thought that it might be a weather balloon or a secret government project, or obviously a guy in a jetpack, or some sort of drone made to look like a guy in a jetpack, where maybe it's like a drone and then you put like a cover on it where it's like jetpack shaped, and then it's also got a side thingy of a man, so then when it's flying around. It kind of looks like a man in a jetpack. It honestly could have been any of these things. No one ever witnessed this taking off or landing, and whenever they did try to track it, a few minutes after they saw it, it was often, flown out of sight, and so it was never captured or identified. But as I said, a very, very cool and fun mystery. John Babacom Lee's attempted execution. So this wasn't just one attempted execution, or even two. This was 3 attempted executions made on a man named John Lee, and all 3 of them, for completely undetermined reasons, all 3 of them ended up failing. And this happened in 1885, and John was at the time convicted of killing his employer, and this was a lady named Emma Keyes. And although the evidence was a little scattered, the case wasn't entirely clear at all. John was basically like the only person around at the time, and so police were like, okay, there's not much evidence, but this guy probably did it. So they sentenced him to death by hanging, and then eventually they, got the gallows, they moved them, they fixed them up again, and then they had John walk up into the trapdoor area, they put the rope around his neck, they set him up for the hanging, and then they pulled the lever and the trapdoor wouldn't open. So they're like, geez, they go down, they try and fix it, and they get John off the stage. They mess around with the gallows a little bit. They end up fixing the trapdoor. It's, it opens properly. Then they're like, all right, second try. They get John, they put him back there, they get everything ready, and then they go to pull the trapdoor again, and nothing happens. And they do the whole thing again. They get him off stage, they make sure it's fixed, they inspect it, and when it didn't go off the third time, the medical officer who is present was like, I basically can't have this. And he refused to stay any longer for any more executions. And so without the medical officer, they couldn't perform these executions. And so they ended up just calling the whole thing off. John was then sentenced to life in prison instead of death. And the mystery of why these gallows didn't open is still an unsolved mystery. The executioner, who is a man named James Berry, was apparently very meticulous. He was very careful and diligent with these things. So the chance of him kind of missing something or making a mistake is pretty low. And as I said, they also checked the trapdoor and the gallows before actually using them, and apparently they seem to work fine. And theories about this one range from the executioner for some reason not wanting to kill John, either, I don't know, for personal reasons, or maybe he was paid off, or there was someone underneath the gallows, maybe like one of the scaffolders, who for some reason snuck in a way to, wedge a piece of wood in so it wouldn't work, and then obviously when they stopped everything, went down to inspect it, by that time he had taken out the piece of wood. Or from the gallows actually just being faulty, being in misalignment after they were moved from where they were originally. Or maybe something akin to divine intervention, maybe it wasn't his time to go yet. But yeah, as I said, he ended up getting re-sentenced to life in prison, and then ended up serving just 22 years before being released. And honestly, I'm not too sure if John was even guilty to begin with, as the conviction and the evidence was kind of a bit loose and sparse on this case. But why he ended up surviving those 3 attempts, we will probably never know. Jofar Vorin was a guy who appeared in this little German village in the 1850s, and he just rocked up like a traveler of some kind. The police asked him who he was, where he came from, what he wanted, as they said they didn't want any travelers, any vagabonds up to no good in their little village. And this is when things started to get a little bit weird. So he could basically only speak broken German, and he said he came from a country called Laxaria, which doesn't exist, and he said the country was on a continent named Sacria, which also doesn't exist. And he said he had come to Europe to find his long-lost brother, and he had traveled for many, many days and weeks and months across the Atlantic Ocean. And when I said that he could only speak broken German, I kind of lied on that. He could also speak Abramian or Abramian, I don't know how to pronounce it because the language doesn't exist, and Laxarian, which was apparently the language of Laxaria, which again doesn't exist. He said he was a Christian kind of sorts, but his religion was called Ispatian or Ispatian, and he said that the 5 great compartments of planet Earth were where he was from, Sacria, but also there was Afla, there was Asla, and Orsla, and also Eupla, which comment below where you think he got that inspiration from. But he was all in all a pretty fascinating figure. They brought him up from this small little village that he was found at, all the way to the great Frankfurt on the Oder, where they basically interviewed him, talked to him, studied him, tried to learn as much about who he was and where he came from as they could. And according to the account, he later ended up dying of starvation for unknown reasons. And that was basically the end of the account. So where he actually came from, what he was doing there, whether he was a time traveler or an alien or just a kind of kooky person, we still don't know. Judy Weikert was a 34-year-old woman who got stabbed to death while out on a morning jog in 1984, Oklahoma. And Judy was a massive runner. Like, at the time, she was actually training for a marathon. And so she left the house at 7:30 that morning, just out for a casual 16-mile run, and she was found dead around 2 hours later by the side of the road where she was running, having been assaulted, attacked, stabbed by what she described as a white guy. And the people who found her did call an ambulance. She was immediately rushed to the hospital, but sadly ended up dying from her wounds. Now, the first suspect, as it normally is in these cases, was, her husband, as he also was the last person to see her alive and well, before these attacks. But he was soon ruled out as a suspect, not in small part due to Judy's description of the attacker, because if it had been someone as close to her as her husband, she likely would have recognized his face, his build, his voice, and so she would have just said, "My husband did it," instead of saying it was a white guy. So it sounded like she didn't know her attacker. But they ruled the husband out, they ruled out a bunch more people, and they did have somewhat of a list of potential suspects, but they were also slowly kind of ruled out one by one, and this case just never reached a conviction. There wasn't enough evidence on any one individual person to actually charge them with anything, and so whoever it was that brutally attacked Judy on that morning is still a mystery, and this case remains unsolved. The Jusco ATM Phantom. So Jusco was the name of the shopping malls in Japan in like the 1980s, or 1980s and 1990s really. But like any good shopping mall, they had various shops. Can't really be a shopping mall without shops. But they had clothing stores, they had furniture stores, restaurants, a food court, and one part of this mall was something called the ATM Corner, which was kind of like a whole area where all the ATMs were, or at least, a fair few of them. And it was on this fateful day in 2004 that a 68-year-old man with, shopping bags in hand, he was walking along to one of the ATMs. He went up to the machine, took out his card, entered in his PIN, and took out some cash. And when he kind of was walking up to the machines, he said he noticed this kind of dodgy looking woman just hanging around, all suspicious like, but he didn't really pay it any mind. He took his money out, and as he was walking away, this woman seemingly purposefully bumped into him, and she was carrying a baby, in her front, in a baby harness. I don't really know what they're called, kangaroo pouch, but this lady bumped into him, and as he was, oh, sorry sort of thing, she more or less attacked him. She felt his trousers, she grabbed his wallet, she tried to run away with it, and he grabbed her arm, he was fighting her, and when she realized that he was stronger than her and she wasn't going to get the wallet, she basically started to make a scene. She started to scream, "Thief, thief, help me." And if you're a passerby, if you just come upon this scene, you see a young lady with a kid with this old man grabbing her hand, seemingly trying to take her money. Like, it's not normally the other way around of a woman with a baby robbing a man. So everyone around immediately thought, oh, he's trying to steal her money. And so they basically pulled them apart, they secured the man, they ended up calling the police. The police came along and were actually very rough with this man. They put him in handcuffs, put him on the ground, maybe kicked him around a bit. And in all of this commotion, this lady basically vanished. Maybe she just vanished straight into thin air. Maybe she ended up phantom just dancing off into the shadows. But sadly for this case and for this old man, the stress and commotion and all that this lady caused and then the police caused resulted in this man more or less having a cardiac arrest, and even though he was rushed to hospital, he did actually end up dying. And it was only years later when police actually released CCTV footage of this event, and in it you can see this phantom woman, and when everyone saw these images, they thought that this lady looked incredibly weird. Like, they didn't know exactly what it was about her, but she was very strange. She looked maybe like an alien, or like she had like a fake face or something. And if her face was not real, that begs the question, was the baby even real? And also, strangely, this woman seemed to only really appear on this CCTV. Like, they checked other CCTVs in different parts of the mall, but they couldn't see her in any of the other exits or entrances or anything like that. So again, it seemed like she just vanished into thin air, which might explain the, phantom name, and might explain why she has never been caught. The Kaikoura lights were these lights seen in 1978 over the Kaikoura Mountains in New Zealand. And they were thought to be like UFOs by quite a few people. And this is when this crew aboard this airplane saw these lights, hovering, bopping around outside. And the lights seemed to follow the craft for quite a while and then just disappeared. And the pilot described this UFO as huge, with like these 5 small lights on. And a few of the crew members said that they saw like these little spinning discs of light flying from the craft and then eventually disappearing. And what's super interesting about this case was that these objects were actually also seen and detected on both the local air traffic control radars as well as the plane's onboard radar. So this clearly wasn't just like a visual sighting. And after this story broke, basically like a week later, a crew from Australia said that they were basically going to cover this story, but they wanted to get some, B-roll of like the sky and maybe like outside of a plane window just for the story. And so the filming crew actually went up in a plane and flew up around the same area that the lights were originally seen at. And then, as they were recording the B-roll for this story, they ended up seeing very similar lights to the actual original story. And they were filming at the time, so we do have it on tape. And at the time, the New Zealand Air Force ended up, investigating this case. And they said it might have been anything from like lights reflected in the sky. And these lights might have been like from squid boats on the water shooting off into the sky reflected off clouds, or meteors that were flying through the sky, or reflected lights from like trains and cars, or the planet Venus. But I think all of these light theories fail to address that these lights were originally seen on radar, which I'm pretty sure radar doesn't just like pick up reflections. You need to have something actually solid there for the sound to bounce off. So could this have been aliens and UFOs? Perhaps. But years after this case, the CIA released a, they declassified one of their documents regarding this case, and they admitted in the document that it was a very, very strange and unique case, because there was a large amount of documented evidence about it. There was a mixture of visual sightings and of radar. There were witnesses both from these planes and from, on ground with the radar. And we actually had full color footage of this event. So a pretty strange mystery all around. Is it conclusive proof of aliens and UFOs? I mean, it might be. But let me know what you think on this one down below. The Kazakhstan jetpack monstrosity. So this was a pretty simple but pretty strange sighting in 1936 in Kazakhstan. And this is where a 15-year-old girl was making her way to school one day, where she saw this strange black thing floating in the sky, and she described it as a medium-sized man with black overalls, a black helmet, just, chilling there. And so she was a little curious. She started to look at this thing, and then it turned towards her and started flying in her direction. And she panicked. She tried to hide, but there was nowhere really to hide. So she ran for a little bit, kind of tried to duck down, and when she turned around to look at this thing, she found that it had disappeared. And one thing to note is that jetpacks weren't really like mass-produced or invented until around about the 1950s. So with this being the 1930s, it likely wasn't a jetpack as far as we know. It could have been like some early government development of a jetpack, maybe a prototype of sorts, or of course some sort of flying cryptid, so it wasn't actually a jetpack, or an alien, a weird jetpack shaped UFO or something. Could be really any of those things. But what it actually was, as of today, we can't really say. The Little Miss Nobody case was actually a case that was recently solved in 2022, but there are still some major parts of it which are still unsolved. But it involved this young girl between the ages of like 3 and 6 who was found dead in Arizona in 1960, and they determined that it had died around 2 weeks ago. But they couldn't determine who it was, where it came from, how she died, and as I said, before the girl was identified, that was more or less the entire case. They did have a body, but not really much else. But in 2022, they managed to actually successfully get a DNA sample from the body, and they matched it up to a missing girl from the 1960s, Sharon Gallegos. And then a more full picture of what actually might have happened started to form. And the kidnapping was perpetrated by these two individuals, this man and this woman, who apparently were seen outside of Sharon's home in this dark green car, kind of sitting there watching her, watching the family, watching the other kids. But a lot of these details actually came out after the fact. So before she was kidnapped, there was like 1 or 2 sightings of maybe this weird car, but then it wasn't there the next day, so it just kind of got swept under the rug. But Sharon apparently started to act kind of progressively stranger and stranger. She was sometimes visibly upset whenever she saw this green car, but at the time the parents didn't really know why, or at least they didn't really follow up on it enough. But basically, this man and this woman were in this dark green car. They were stalking Sharon and her family for weeks, and then one day when she was out the back of the house in an alley playing with other kids, this car pulled up. The woman got out. She offered Sharon some candy if she would get into the car with them, which it's like, how stereotypical do you want to be? But Sharon refused. This woman just grabbed Sharon by the arm anyway. She forced her into the car, and then they drove away. And then, sensibly, the other kids went and told the parents, and a major search was started. They immediately called a bunch of police cars. They did like a blockade of the area where they were checking cars, they were interviewing people if they saw anything. But sadly, from all of that, they never found this car, and they never found Sharon. And 10 days later, in another state, this body of this child was found, and they dubbed the child Little Miss Nobody. And they did at first suspect that it might have been Sharon, but as I said, firstly, it was like 700 miles away from where Sharon was taken. She had different nail paint to when she went missing. She had different clothes, which obviously in a week and a half can be changed, but it was just, more and more stuff to go against the fact that it might be Sharon. And initially they estimated this girl's age to be around 7 years old, and with Sharon being only 5 years old, this was just another thing to kind of put it off being Sharon. And as I said, they were never really able to get a full DNA sample until 2022, but it's honestly just a very, very sad case involving these two absolute monsters who kidnapped Sharon. Like, I don't know why they wanted her. We don't really know what they did to her, and we don't know who they are. It seems like they will never, get justice served. And Sharon's family did say that it was a good thing that she was identified, because they said all of these years she's just been either missing or being called, Little Miss Nobody. But now she actually has her name back. People can remember her as that name. But yeah, as I said, it's a very heartbreaking, sad, and brutal case that hopefully will someday be solved, if for no other reason than to just get these monsters off the streets. But only time will tell. The man in the plastic bag is a very interesting entry, but this was just this man or being that was seen by multiple people in 2018 in California, just more or less like crouching down in this tunnel, and he was wearing just boxer shorts, he had no shoes on, and he was wearing a plastic bag over his head. The people approached him, they tried to talk to him, and he apparently just got up, didn't say a thing, and just walked out of the tunnel towards these woods, still wearing the plastic bag, without any shoes on, and just wearing boxer shorts. And honestly, I don't know why this is in a mystery iceberg. Like, surely it was just some disturbed guy. Like, honestly, I've seen stranger things in London, but we have covered it, so now you know. Michael Donaghy was a 4-year-old kid who went missing from Victoria, Canada in 1991. And this was on a Sunday afternoon. Michael and his mother had gone to the local Blanchard school, where the mum was playing football, as she liked to do. And since this was probably boring for Michael watching his mum play football, he asked if he could go to the playground, and his mum said, okay, fine, you can go there. She let him go by himself, but she said when you get there, absolutely stay there until your father gets there. And then Michael left to go to the playground, shortly followed by his father, but when his father got to the playground, Michael was nowhere to be seen. They searched the entire area, they alerted locals, they started a massive search, and in this search was firefighters, police, local people, friends and family, even police from like nearby counties that they had called in. So this was a huge search, pulling resources from like all over the city, but sadly they just couldn't find Michael. He had been taken in broad daylight in the middle of a pretty public place. It just kind of had no people around at that time. So it's not super likely that this could have been planned, or at least planned far in advance. Or maybe it was, they were, staking out the playground for any kids who might have happened to walk by. But the police said that since this was in the 90s, and they were, at least at the start of the investigation, receiving hundreds of tips per hour, they had to basically go through and organize all of these tips one by one, and they had to do it by hand. And they said that cost a lot of their manpower, it slowed down the investigation, and that this case might have actually gone better if this was like the modern time, and they were able to filter through, organize, read, etc. these messages using some sort of computer system. And over the years, after receiving thousands of these tips, they basically managed to gather that this man was probably a man in his 40s to 50s, and there was some suspicious brown van kind of hanging around the area at the time that wasn't there when they did the eventual search. And that was more or less it. They didn't really have any physical evidence, they didn't have any DNA evidence, and they investigated and interviewed, local criminals or people who had maybe a history of abduction, of anything to do with children. But even with that, they came up empty-handed. And there have over the years been like multiple DNA tests done on people who might have matched Michael's description, but were maybe 10, 15, 20 years older than Michael was. So like the age he would have been now. But all of the DNA results came back negative, and this case, still some 33 years later, is still unsolved. Michael Emmert was this guy involved in a horrific murder in Seattle in 2001. And Mike and his wife, Mary Beth, both worked in real estate at the time, and so they were a fairly successful couple. They were married, they were happy, and on this particular day, Mike had gone out to meet a man named Steve. And Steve was a man who was potentially interested in buying a house from them. So Mike and Steve met up around midday, and this particular house was like really far out of the way. But Steve said that's what he liked about the house. It had a lot of privacy, it had its own, private lot. And then nothing happened until around an hour later, the homeowner actually came home for lunch, and she got to the front door. It was a little weird because the door was actually opened, but she knew there was a viewing on that day. She thought, perhaps they were inside and they left the door open. So she went inside, she heard the shower running, and she saw a trail of blood. And so she called out to them, no response. She followed the trail of blood, and it led through into the bathroom, and there in the bathtub with the shower running over him was Mike's dead body. He had been stabbed 19 times and seemingly left for dead in the bath. And just a side note, I don't know how these people always discover a body or discover blood and then continue through into the rest of the house. That's just insane to me. The murderer could still be in the house. There could have been multiple killers. And if you stumble upon some guy who's just killed another guy, there is no way that he's actually letting you go. And you think if you shout out to them that they're gonna reply or something. So in my eyes, anytime you see anything like this, immediately just back out of the house, call the police, and try and be as safe as possible. But Mike's car was eventually found in the parking lot of the local mall. So Mike and Steve seemingly had met up at the mall. They had both gotten into Steve's car. He had driven them to the house, and then he had killed Mike, got back into his own car, and left the scene. And Steve's wedding ring and his expensive watch were both missing, so maybe that was to make it look like a robbery. And his phone and his wallet were also taken, but they were dumped for whatever reason back in Seattle. And this case is a little strange in that eventually, 10 years later, some DNA evidence found at the scene was linked to a man named Gary Kruger, who was an ex-police officer who had died a few months before the link was made, and he had died from breaking into someone's home and then I think trying to escape and then drowning. So that was probably, he got in his car, maybe crashed into a lake or off a bridge or something. But Gary was at least a light or latent suspect for some other murders, for obviously some home invasions, because he actually died while trying to escape one. And so it was thought at this point that the man that Mike was meeting, Steve, he was actually Gary Kruger. Steve did apparently have a limp and use a walking stick, but first of all, that's pretty easy to fake. You just buy a walking stick and then pretend to walk with a limp. And also it might have been used to kind of disarm Mike, so he didn't see Steve as much of a threat, so he could kind of get away with getting closer and killing him. And a lot of people do believe that Gary Kruger was Steve, the man who killed Mike, but because he had died before they even made this connection, made this link, he was never able to be charged, he was never prosecuted for this, and the reason and motive for Gary killing Mike was honestly a little unclear. Mike didn't really seem to have any enemies, he wasn't that sort of guy, and Mike and Gary didn't seem to know each other. Like, Gary had done a bit of work as an estate agent, but nothing close enough that would warrant, him killing him. But another theory was that Gary was actually working as a professional hitman, because some of the other killings that he was suspected of doing seemed to have kind of no motive as well. It seemed like he was at least capable of killing people for no reason other than money. But if this was the case, this raises almost a bigger question of who paid Steve to kill Mike, and why did they want Mike dead? None of this was ever found out, unfortunately. They might have maybe cracked the case if Gary was still alive and he made a confession or some more evidence came forward, but that never happened, and so whoever killed Mike on that day, and for what reason, is still a mystery. The case of Naoyuki Kano is a very strange, very puzzling, and very gross case. And this took place all the way back in 1989 in a small village in the Fukushima prefecture in Japan. And this is where a lady who we'll just refer to as the teacher, because she was a teacher, but this is when she was going to the bathroom in the school one day, and inside of the toilet she saw a boot or a shoe. And these toilets weren't like the standard sitting toilets, they were what's known as squatting toilets. So as you can see here, you'd stand over the toilet, squat, do your business, and then everything would go down into the septic tank and then be drained every so often from the outside. But as I said, she saw a shoe down there, so she obviously wondered how it got down there. She quickly got up, she told her colleagues about this, and they, with some police, went to the outside portion of this toilet, the portion with the pipe where the waste collectors would collect the waste from, and they opened this up, and immediately what they saw was this body. Or more accurately, they saw just these two legs. And these two legs were attached to a body, but they couldn't really see it from this angle. But inside the septic tank of this toilet was a young man named Naoyuki Kano. He wasn't moving, he wasn't alive, he had been down here for at least several days, and he had somehow, for some reason, found himself wedged into this almost impossibly tight space. And when they eventually got him out, investigators concluded that he had basically died from hypothermia, as well as being, kind of squished for several days. And obviously being inside of a septic tank doesn't really help. There are just so many questions about this case, which we will circle back on and get back to in just a second. But as I said, he had suffered from hypothermia, and this was because it was February at the time, and the entire village was covered in this thick layer of snow. And he was in a septic tank, which isn't exactly a warm place. And he wasn't wearing shoes, and he was also wearing nothing on the top half of his body, like on his upper body, except for this jacket, which he wasn't wearing, but he had removed and folded up neatly and was kind of holding on his chest. But when the police first discovered him, they saw the legs and they tried to pull him out in multiple ways, to bend his legs and, do all that, but they basically couldn't get him out of the pipe. So they actually had to end up getting a crane pulling the entire pipe, septic tank, all of that out of the ground, and then they cut into the pipe and then were finally able to free Naoyuki. And the main question was, why was he in there, and how exactly did he get in there? Now, Naoyuki himself was quite a smart kid. He was popular, he was kind of a cool dude, not cool as in like jock, but he was a cool kind of nerdy, kind of down-to-earth guy. He was quite friendly with everyone. No one knew him as, the town creep. It was almost quite the opposite. And so the story, if you believe that he did this to himself, would be that he drove his car here nearby, which the car was found nearby with the keys still in it, which seemed to signal that he was planning at least on coming back to the car within a short-ish period of time. But what? He drove the car there, parked up, left the keys in the car, then got out of the car as he was walking through the snow, kicked off one of his shoes, which was found nearby the car, and then walked the rest of the way to this toilet area, or this outside pipe outside the school, all in the freezing cold snow, then took his jacket off, somehow folded it on his chest before he climbed in, and then, maybe went upside down, maybe some other way, contorted his body, squeezed his way into this pipe, and then when he was down there, he was too contorted to get back up. And all of this was suggested maybe he wanted to get a peep of the teacher as she kind of used the toilet. But like all of that, just for that reason, it doesn't sound like something an intelligent person would do. So there were a bunch of theories that didn't want to accept that he was, a creep or weird in this way. And so they said he must have been forced down there, which this sort of thing sounds kind of like a mafia hit or a Yakuza hit, where it's like overly theatrical or something, which might have been a possibility, but he had no links or ties to the mafia, to Yakuza. Nobody knew why they might have even targeted him if this were the case. And so there was another theory that this wasn't by the Yakuza. This was instead by the boyfriend of the teacher. So the teacher, who was actually quite good friends with Naoyuki, it was speculated that maybe Naoyuki and the teacher were having an affair. The boyfriend ended up finding out, and so he took Naoyuki and killed him by putting him in the tank of the toilet of the teacher. But that entire story, it's kind of fanciful. There's no like actual evidence for it. It's all just theoretical. And also another part of this was that the injuries on Naoyuki's body seemed to kind of line up with him doing this to himself. Like if someone had kidnapped him, had forced him down here, you might get like, bruising on his face of someone hitting him, or on his head, or him struggling, trying to fight back. He might have got, cuts, bruises anywhere on his body, but he more or less didn't have bruises or scratches anywhere, except for a few kind of small areas around his elbows. And this was thought to be caused by when he went in there. Maybe he was trying to, get his way out. He was trying to fold his way back to get out of the pipe, and so he ended up scratching his elbows. And that was more or less the case. No one was ever charged in this case. The statute of limitations ran out in like 2014, meaning that nobody can ever be charged for it now, even if they came forward with like full evidence and a full confession, which once again is insane. But over 4,000 people have actually signed a petition to reopen this case to try and get some justice for Naoyuki, because they believe he was either framed or he was murdered for some reason by someone. And so I wasn't lying when I said that this was an insane, crazy case, and it's hard to pinpoint an exact, outcome or theory for it, because him doing this to himself, or at least accidentally, seems to kind of fit at least some of the evidence, but then at the same time is just absolutely nonsensical and insane. But let me know what you think about this case, as it is a very, very interesting and strange one. Neo-dinosaurs in the Amazon basin. So this is basically modern sightings of dinosaurs in and around the Amazon basin. And modern in this context is quite relative, because the sightings go back to like more than 100 years ago, but in terms of, actual dinosaur span or dinosaur eras going back millions of years, hundreds of years ago is fairly recent. And obviously dinosaurs went extinct millions of years ago, so for them to be seen anywhere in the world, sometimes in Africa, but in this case around South America, is incredibly strange. And a lot of these dinosaurs seen in and around the Amazon basin are of stuff like long-necked dinosaurs, like the sauropod, or the plesiosaur, which I like to call it by its proper name, the lapras. And these are just some of the dinosaur types spotted. There have also been spottings of stuff like the toxodon and the iguanodon, all of which are supposedly long extinct. But there are a few interesting points to make in this case. One being just how absolutely huge the Amazon is. Like, no, really, it's insane. It's like 28 times the size of Britain, and it's more or less equivalent to the size of the continental United States, which you can just imagine the entire United States. Like, it's hard enough to find something in one city, but in a state, in multiple states, in the entire United States, that would be almost impossible. But then imagine the entire United States filled with tropical rainforests, with no roads, no road signs, or, very few, and with very few populations, very few civilizations living there. So with this size, I can absolutely believe some, undiscovered species, some strange animals that we have never seen, living in like a tiny, tiny little area of the Amazon. I think it's perfectly possible. Or, these could be hoaxes or mistaken identities, like someone thought they saw an iguanodon, but they actually saw maybe a large caiman, which are these alligator-looking buggers. So, a very interesting entry, and I think the Amazon is one of those places that terrifies me and mystifies me, like the ocean, like space, and you would hate to find yourself there on a Friday night after too many drinks. God damn the Amazon. Really, really. This is the third time this year. How does this keep happening? Neutral monism. So this is a strange philosophical theory that more or less says that reality isn't physical and it's also not mental, but it is some kind of weird neutral state that kind of expresses itself as mental or physical. And I know that might not make any sense right now, but if you'll imagine this really bad analogy that I just made up of like material being everything's made out of matter. So just imagine in your head everything's made out of rocks, and idealism being kind of everything's made out of ideas or concepts. So if you can just imagine everything's made out of water. And so this side is saying everything is rocks. So rocks are obviously rocks. Water on this side would just be like liquid clear rock. A cheeseburger would just be like edible meaty rock, but it's all being made up of rock on the base level. And this side would argue that no, actually everything is water. So water is water, but rocks aren't rocks, they're just solid water. And cheeseburgers on this side would be like, well, that's just water, but it's like meaty, bready, cheesy, solid water. So materialism and idealism both express in a way how the universe is made up. Whereas neutral monism would argue that the world isn't made up of water or rock, but actually it's made up of something called atoms. And atoms is just an example. They don't actually argue this because atoms are, technically matter. But in this crappy analogy that I've made up, they would say they're actually made of atoms, and both water and rock are made up of the same thing way deep down. So that goes for materialism and idealism, where this neutralism is basically saying that the world isn't matter and it's also not ideas or concepts, but it's some neutral form that makes up all of these things. And for the most part, we don't really know what that neutral form is. And sorry if I didn't explain this concept, fully or even well at all. It is a very difficult concept which I am still struggling to kind of wrap my head around exactly what they mean by it, but it is a kind of interesting entry. So grab a drink. My choice today is mint and fennel tea, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. The North Augusta Huddle House shooting. So this was an extremely random, tragic case that took place in 2005 in South Carolina, and on this day, on this morning at around 6 a.m, just as the sun was rising, a lady named Constance Davidson was driving on her way to work when she pulled into a Burger King drive-thru to grab some breakfast. And as she was chilling there in the drive-thru, a man came up to her car and demanded that she get out of the car, give him the keys, and pointed a gun at her. And she didn't even think for a second. Immediately, she just ducked down, floored the gas, and did manage to get away eventually to a nearby gas stop, but she was shot in the back in the process. Then, I guess, frustrated, this man left the Burger King and made his way over to the nearby Huddle House, which Huddle House is kind of like a Waffle House. They do greasy food, pancakes, waffles, bacon, eggs, and coffee, tea, water, etc. I mean, everywhere does water, but it's that sort of establishment. They're open pretty much 24/7. But on this particular morning, there was a group of retirees who were having their morning coffee here, and this was like routine for them at this point. They had been meeting up at this Huddle House having morning coffee for years, and by this point they had already had their coffee. Two of the retirees were making their way out of the Huddle House, and this unidentified man immediately walked up to the entrance, saw the two men coming out, and just shot both of them. He didn't ask them for money, he didn't demand their car or keys or vehicle or like anything. He didn't even say a single word. He just saw them, pulled up his gun and shot them. And William Powell was hit straight in the head, and he seemingly died either instantly or at the scene. And Reverend Earl Carter was shot in the throat. So police were called, ambulances were called. Constance Davidson, the woman who was shot from the Burger King, she ended up thankfully making a full recovery. And Reverend Earl Carter, after being shot in the throat, did make a recovery, but not a full one because he had to have, quite a bit of surgery. And William Powell was sadly found dead at the scene. But But after shooting these two men, the gunman then went to another car and held it up at gunpoint. The lady did just hand over her car, so she didn't get shot, thankfully. But the gunman took her car, went driving around, and the search at the time couldn't find the gunman, couldn't find the car. But strangely, the car was returned, or rather left abandoned, somewhat near the general area that these shots took place originally, and it was found 6 hours later. The engine was still warm, and 300 miles or so had been tracked on the car's mileometer. So it's not like the gunman just took this car, drove to a nearby garage or something, and just chilled for that time. Like, he had driven for 6 hours over 300 miles, which probably means he drove, somewhere 150 miles away, came back, and then abandoned the car, which is all honestly very strange. Where exactly did he go? Why did he return back to this area? Did he perhaps live in this area? And if so, where was he going? And I mean, how do you need to get somewhere that badly that you literally try to steal 2 cars and shoot 2 people, or actually shoot 3 people? There is still a reward set for this case. As I said, the gunman was never found or identified, but the exact motives of this gunman are very strange, to say the least. The Oomph is this adorable little creature, and it is said to be around kind of maybe yay big, between the size of a big lizard and a toad, which is a very specific, unique sizing. It's like if you were to measure something's weight in like how many plump dogs does this weigh? About 4.5 plump dogs. But this creature has these long claws, these spikes on its back, and like a traveling cheetah, is spotted all over. But it eats mainly bird eggs, and when it comes upon a nest with birds in it, or rather with eggs in it, it is said to make this sound deep down in its throat, something like, which it's probably why it's called the Oomph, which is a bit weird, but yeah, that's the Oomph. Patricia Gagne was a 17-year-old girl who was assaulted and killed in 1984 in Massachusetts. She called her family to say she would be back home late one night, and she was making her way back from her boyfriend's house, and at around 11 p.m. she got off the bus, made her way home. It was around 2 blocks or so, but sadly, she was never seen again. She was reported missing, a search was soon started, and they soon found Patricia's body the next day at the site of a nearby factory, naked and beaten to death. They immediately obviously started an investigation, but sadly really made no headway. And on this one, there weren't really any major suspects. Like, police pretty much knew it was a guy and thought that perhaps it might be a local guy because of how well he seemed to know the area. But that was really about as far as they got. They got some evidence from the scene, but as I said, it was never linked to anyone or really progressed the case at all. And still to this day, 40 years later, friends and family gather round to celebrate Patricia by playing her favorite song, Purple Rain by Prince, and lighting these lanterns in her memory. But as far as the case goes, it is still open to this day. Paula Jean Weldon. Now, the case of Paula Jean Weldon is quite an old case, and it involves the disappearance of this girl, who we actually covered briefly earlier on in the Iceberg, in the Bennington Triangle, and this was all the way back in 1946. And this was on a cold December morning when 18-year-old college student Paula, she was out hiking the Long Trail in Vermont. Now, granted, she wasn't walking the entire trail, just, parts of it, and she'd actually tried to rally along her friends to come with her, but they were either too busy or they didn't want to come. She ended up packing very lightly, but still sensibly. She packed a tiny bit of money, she packed sensible clothes, but it wasn't like she packed a tent or multiple changes of clothes. Like, she expected to go out for a few hours, hike for a little bit, and then come back home. And on that morning, she headed out, she hitchhiked to the start of the part of the trail that she was starting from, and then she started her hike. And that morning, she met multiple other hikers. She was quite friendly with them, she talked to them, asked them for tips, that sort of thing. And the last hiker to see her hiking was the last time that she was ever seen alive. And when she didn't return to, the school when she was supposed to return, most of the school didn't really even know. And the few people who did know at the time weren't super worried. This was Paula, she wasn't right in her bed back at bedtime. Maybe she was out with other friends, maybe she was in the library studying. Like, it wasn't a super big deal. But by the morning, when they found that Paula still hadn't shown up, then they started to get a little bit worried. And she was soon reported missing. There was a huge search that was started, and the school itself actually closed for several days. The teachers were involved in the search, the students, friends, family, police, firefighters, and just local townspeople all organized and all involved in the search for Paula. Now, first they searched the obvious places, the trail itself, the woods, the surrounding nearby areas, and that didn't really turn anything up. And it should also be noted that most of the people searching weren't really thinking of anything as nefarious as like a murder or kidnapping. They thought that maybe, it was after dark, Paula had gotten lost in the woods or on the trail, and so they were shouting at her name. Maybe she had been injured, maybe she got some type of amnesia, and they were really expecting this to be just a missing persons case. Like, they were expecting her to, climb down from a tree, say, "Oh, thank God you found me, I've been lost out here." But there was absolutely no sign of Paula. And there were many theories about what actually happened to her. Some of the theories came from people saying that she seemed maybe unusually happy on the day. And so they thought maybe she was in love, maybe she was meeting up with, a boy or a man or something, and then something bad happened. Or she, for some reason, did something to herself in the woods, or she had perhaps, run away and used this as a cover, which these don't really make sense as theories, I don't think, because she did invite people to come with her. So if you're doing something like this, surely you just go off and do it on your own. And even if you're meeting up with a guy, would you really, invite people on the date with you? It seemed like she just wanted to go for a hike. She invited people along, they didn't come, and so she was out there on her own. And naturally, the police started interviewing the hikers. They interviewed anyone who was nearby the area at the time or who saw Paula, and anyone who maybe lived by the area. And when they did these interviews, there was one guy who came up who was of particular interest, and he was a man named Fred Gaudette. He worked as a lumberjack and was, interestingly, one of the last people to see Paula alive. He said he was having an argument with his girlfriend at the time when Paula just kind of happened to walk by, and then he said she walked off, and that was the last he saw of her. And as an alibi, he said after this, he immediately went to his shack and he was there all alone for the entire rest of the day, which that is a hell of a terrible alibi. Oh yeah, I was there. Eyewitnesses? No, I was there alone. No receipts, no nothing, just me and a shack. Or he drove up to a small area of the trail where Paula was heading. And that's whether you believe Fred's initial story or his later one. Because as I said, he initially said he was on his own in his shack, and then he changed it to say, no, actually I did drive up to this part of the trail, and that part was coincidentally where Paula was heading. He also apparently told several people that he knew within 100 feet where Paula's body was buried, and when police questioned him about this, he said, that was just a joke. I was just making small talk sort of thing, which, yeah, haha, funny. I don't think this guy knows what small talk is. But no body was ever found, no forensics, hair, fingerprints, DNA, none of that was ever found. And so this case more or less just kind of fizzled out. And actually, because of how badly this case was handled by the local police, it actually resulted in the Vermont State Police being created. Because before this, Vermont didn't have a national state police. They just had local, town, city polices, etc. But I guess the state was like, bro, this was so badly handled, we need some level of oversight, and so they created the state police. So a very tragic case, and we still don't know where Paula is or what happened to her to this day. PNS Ghazi. So this was a submarine that apparently mysteriously sank in 1971 during a war between India and Pakistan. And the PNS Ghazi was originally a US submarine, and it was given to Pakistan and then later fought in the 1971 war. And during the war, while bopping along all, covert like submarines tend to do, bopping around the coast of India, it was sunk for unknown reasons that, according to Pakistan, were very mysterious. India said, we know exactly how it was sunk because we sunk it with the INS Rajput, which was a destroyer warship. But Pakistan was like, no. It was either an internal explosion, or perhaps for some reason it destroyed itself as it was out there laying mines. It laid one down, accidentally run into it, set it off, and then kaboom. But both of these reasons were dubbed as suspicious by Pakistan, and this has been described as one of the last great mysteries of the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, which maybe I'll do that as my next iceberg. The greatest unsolved mysteries of the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War. I mean, probably not. And I wouldn't say this is necessarily a fascinating mystery, but it is on the iceberg, and so it has been covered. Renee Bruhl, Patricia Blau, and Ann Miller were three young ladies, 19, 19, and 21 years old respectively, who went missing in Indiana in 1966. And these three young ladies were all best friends. They used to like the outdoors, and in particular, horse riding, which will be important a little later on. But on this particular day in July, the girls all went out to the Indiana Dunes State Park, mainly to hang out, to chill, sunbathe, swim a little bit, and according to investigators, they were last seen inside the park, boarding a trimaran type boat that was captained by a young man in his 20s who was well tanned, white, had dark, wavy hair, and was wearing a beach jacket. They got onto the boat with this man, but they left behind on the shore a bunch of their belongings. And these weren't just small things. They left some of their wallets, their car keys, money, and a pack of cigarettes, which, if you're a smoker, you don't really leave behind. So it seems like, all things considered, the girls were at least expecting to return to their belongings and return to the shore within a reasonable amount of time. But, as I said, after they got on this boat, they were never seen again. Their parents soon reported them missing, and a search was started. They searched the woods, the park, the surrounding waters. They had scuba divers go down to try and find the bodies, or to find any evidence of maybe a crash or a wreckage, but absolutely nothing turned up. And the theories and the backgrounds for this case do get a little interesting when you start to dig into them. So as we mentioned earlier, the three girls were like super big into horse riding in particular, and their favorite go-to place was the Tricolor Stables, which was owned by a man named George Jane. And George had a half-brother who was honestly a bit of a psycho. And his half-brother was named Silas, and Silas was part of this illegal horse ring. You know, it was a group of people that called themselves the Syndicate, and they were involved in like anything illegal to do with horses pretty much. So you want to buy or sell illegal horses, you want to do some dodgy bets on horse races, you want to maybe kill one of your horses for insurance money. That was pretty much what the Syndicate did. And Silas absolutely hated George, you know, his half-brother. One of the main reasons that kind of triggered this hatred was because one of George's horses had beaten one of Silas's horses in a race, and I guess that lost Silas some money, probably lost Silas some pride, and so he said, if it's the last thing I do, I will kill you. And then, one day, a lady named Cheryl Rood, who was a worker at these stables, she was running an errand for George. George gave her car keys to go, go into town to do something. She took the car keys, went to the car, opened the door, and the car immediately exploded. Cheryl was instantly killed, and at the time, both George and the police kind of highly suspected this of being Silas's doing. You know, they were as close to knowing as they can be without having actual proof. This explosion was clearly planned for George, but sadly, Cheryl ended up opening the car on that day. And 5 years after this, George was actually shot to death, and Silas was convicted in that killing. So he apparently never let it go. He lost one race to his half-brother and tried to kill him at least 2 times, in the end actually succeeding, 5 years later. But let's rewind to before all of this, before George's death, before these 3 girls went missing. And Patricia, at the time, she ended up buying a horse. And this was apparently a very good horse. It was a strong, powerful, fast horse. She treated it well, she trained it well, and it ended up winning a few races. And apparently, the people who previously owned this horse, the ones who sold it to Patricia, they were absolutely furious about this. They felt like they had been shorted, like the horse was worth more than what Patricia paid. And so that was kind of part of the drama. And the other side was obviously the girls were at the stables quite a lot. Perhaps they had seen something to do with the car explosion or with Silas's other illegal activities while in the area. Maybe they saw something they shouldn't have, they knew too much, and then Silas ended up taking them out, which we know he was absolutely capable of. Another one was that perhaps the girls had actually just run away because 2 of them were dating married men, which is always full of drama, and the other was married herself, but was notably in a very unhappy marriage, with her having inside of her purse a note to her husband saying basically, I don't feel like you love me anymore, you spend all your time fixing cars and hanging out with your friends, and so she wanted a divorce. Now, she hadn't actually given this letter to her her husband, and according to family members, she did change her mind, so she didn't hand over the letter. But it did show at least that, she wasn't in a perfect marriage. The other two girls weren't in perfect relationships either, and it was also rumored that at least one of the girls, but potentially all three, were at the time pregnant. And if you're impregnated by a married man, that is sometimes the sort of thing that people will kill over. Either the wife of one of these men as revenge, or the husbands in order to cover up their affair. So yeah, the theories are Silas killed them to cover up any illegal horse doings, or they ran away to get away from their lives, which for that theory also one of the girls at least had actually planned to run away a few years before this, so it's not completely out of the ordinary for them. Or as I said, this was to do with their relationships, killing them for some reason, or also related to the pregnancy issue. At the time when this all occurred, abortions were actually illegal, so it was not unheard of for these secret clinics to exist and for them to perform abortions, in basements, underground, in strange locations. And so perhaps the husbands had convinced them to get an abortion. They arranged to go out on this boat, do it, in the waters, and then come back, almost like nothing had ever happened. But maybe something went wrong on the boat. Either, they fell overboard and drowned, or the actual abortion went wrong, and so they ended up killing these three girls in order to cover up the secret and the whole operation. Now, the drowning part is apparently far-fetched for the family, because they said pretty much all three of the girls were amazing swimmers. They could have swam for hours sort of skill, but clearly the girls were witnessed getting into the boat. That is the last time they were ever seen, and so whatever actually happened must have happened on the boat, or they were taken somewhere else down the land, down the shore, and that's where whatever happened. And to add to all of this, Silas did actually reportedly say, actually to a local sheriff, he said that he had 3 bodies buried underneath his home, and this was after the 3 girls went missing. But he later said, that was a joke, I'm actually kidding, and they were gonna do the search anyway, but the sheriff that he told this to just so happened to die in a farming accident. So after his death, things got moved around, the search actually never ended up happening, and Silas, years later, died in prison and was never convicted for these crimes, for the 3 girls' disappearance and potential murders. So it's an insane case with some insane theories. There's like 10 different theories, all with little bits of evidence supporting, pros and cons. So it's very hard to pinpoint and go with a super strong theory, as so many of them don't fit all pieces of evidence. So yeah, let me know what you think on this case, and give me your theories on what you think happened. Robert Allen was a mentally challenged traveler, homeless person, transient, who went missing in 1995. And Robert Allen's case is part of a much bigger case, and actually one that we at least partly covered before. And that was the murder of Rachel Timmerman. And I'll just go over it briefly, but this case and the main convicted suspect, Marvin Gabrion, is insane. And basically, Robert Allen had gone missing, and Marvin had, unbeknownst to the police, actually stolen Robert's identity and was using his identity to more or less cash his social security checks. Then, one night in August in 1996, 18-year-old Rachel Timmerman was in a car with a few guys, and one of these guys was 43-year-old family friend Marvin Gabrion. And they were all leaving a party. Marvin eventually pulled up by the side of the road and forced the other 2 men out of the car, and then he just took off, leaving the 2 men by the side of the road, and then proceeded to drive away with Rachel in the car. And then he beat and assaulted Rachel and told her that if she told anyone or did anything about it, that he would basically kill her and her young child. So yeah, right off the bat, absolute psycho. Rachel was, of course, scared, she was terrified, and she had her doubts about actually reporting him, but did want to see him brought to justice, so she ended up going to the police and making a report. He was brought in, he was charged, and the trial for these crimes was coming up in just a few days. And just a few days before the trial was set, Rachel told her father one night that she was going out on a date with some guy, and this guy was just basically a friend of Rachel's. This man also told Rachel to bring bring her kid along. So she went out, she took her daughter, and then evening came and went, midnight came and went, and there was eventually no sight of Rachel or of her daughter. Rachel's dad started to get a little bit worried, but the following day he actually received a letter that was posted to the home, and it was from Rachel saying basically not to worry, that she had gone on holiday and she would be back soon, which he found very strange because Marvin's trial was coming up in just a few days, and the main piece of evidence for this trial was Rachel's witness and testimony. So she was still missing, the trial ended up taking place, but without Rachel's testimony, the police basically just ended up dropping the charges. Then, days after this, the case prosecutor received a letter that was again apparently from Rachel, saying that she apologizes for everything. She was actually the one who tried to have sex with Marvin, and when Marvin said no, she made up these, assault allegations and tried to ruin Marvin's life, and so Marvin was completely innocent, which that sounds extremely believable. And then the dad received another letter saying that her and the kid were both fine and that she would call him soon, but that call never ended up coming through. 2 weeks later, they found Rachel's body at the bottom of a lake, wrapped in chains and concrete, padlocked shut, and disturbingly with her eyes and mouth taped shut. And I think even more disturbingly was the fact that she was actually found to have drowned, which means she wasn't killed and then dumped in the lake. Her eyes and mouth were both taped shut, and she was seemingly thrown into the lake alive. Her 2-year-old daughter was never found, and obviously, the police first suspected Marvin. So they started investigating him, they searched his property, and they found cinder blocks on his property, they found chains and keys that matched the locks found at the scene, and eventually tape, and eventually a boat, and all of this evidence seemingly implicating Marvin, but by this point, he had skipped town and was nowhere to be found. And on top of that, one of the men who was originally kicked out of the car that, first night, he was a man named Wayne Davis, and had been missing since just a few days after Marvin got released from prison, or jail. And Wayne had also agreed to testify against Marvin, and then, he went missing. And on top of Marvin going missing, Wayne going missing, there was also a man named John Weeks who went missing. And John Weeks was the man who invited Rachel out on a date, and he himself was kind of close with Marvin. Marvin was later found and picked up in New York, and he was at the time found to be cashing Robert Allen's checks. And he was actually charged with Rachel's murder shortly after this, and sentenced to life in prison. But we still don't know what happened to Robert Allen. And Marvin, if you can't already tell, was an absolute psychopath, and he seemed to manipulate kind of everyone around him. And during this trial, various witnesses from, around town, or neighbors, or people who knew Marvin, came out with all of these stories, with all of these accounts, and some of them are absolutely insane. He had, according to various neighbors, shot a rifle at them, shot a rifle at their home, set one of their houses on fire because of a disagreement, aimed a rifle at another one and at her 2-year-old kid, and then got into his car and followed them in their car for miles. Another one said he came in and assaulted her in her home. Another one said he had beaten him and kicked him and punched his wife and his kid, all for interrupting a card game. And another one said that Marvin said to him, "I can shoot anyone in the neighborhood, there's nothing anyone can do about it." And then the next day, he actually ended up shooting at this neighbor's home with seemingly no care as to who was home, where the people were. And this was all before Rachel was even kidnapped or anything. So it seems like a guy that should have been locked up long ago, but for whatever reason wasn't. Wayne Davis's body was actually found later on, being killed in more or less the same way that Rachel was. And so Marvin was obviously the main suspect for Wayne Davis's killing as well. But sadly, Rachel's 2-year-old kid, Shannon, and the transient drifter, Robert Allen, were never found, and to this day, we have no idea what happened to them. Satara Stratton. So I went through this case, and I honestly couldn't really find any mystery at all. And Satara Stratton was the name of this actress, who went by the name Satara Silver, like a stage name, and she had moved to LA to pursue a acting career, and she did have a few roles. She acted for a little bit, and then fell on hard times, became homeless, and was more or less manipulated by this older man, 43-year-old Paul Constantinescu. Post-production Connor here, but I just realized as I was editing this that this Paul Constantinescu guy actually appeared on To Catch a Predator 6 years before this disappearance. So here he is, he rocks up, he's trying to meet a 13-year-old girl, interviewed by Chris Hansen, and then 6 years after this case, he gets caught up with Satara Stratton. And he more or less kind of legally persuaded and kidnapped her, and he used her for sexual pleasure. He got her hooked on various substances, and she was missing for around 3 months and then eventually turned back up. She told the police and her family of everything that Paul did, and that's more or less the entire case. As I said, I couldn't really find a mystery in here. She did very sadly die many years later from an overdose, which was probably rooted in her experiences with Paul. So as far as I'm concerned, he's responsible for her death. But as far as mysteries go, I can't really find one. The Saviors of Doris Smith. So Doris Smith was a deputy sheriff in Missouri in 1995, and at the time she was one day transporting a prisoner, and she was all alone. She was transporting this prisoner on a 4-hour journey, and sometime during this journey the prisoner managed to break loose and was in a struggle with Doris to get her weapon. But right when this happened, this car pulled over, these 2 guys got out and ended up restraining the prisoner. And if it weren't for these 2 guys, things might have gone very, very badly. But as I said, they came out, restrained the prisoner, more or less saved Doris. And then as Doris was getting the prisoner back in the car, as she was getting her bearings, she kind of turned around to thank these strangers. But they had already gotten in their car and fled the scene. Or that makes it sound like they were guilty. They just got in their car, drove away. She never got their names, she never got the license plate, she didn't get any information about these guys, and some people think that they were angels come down to Earth to save Doris. Others, like myself, think that they were maybe criminals themselves. You know, maybe they were really, really bad criminals, or maybe they were just, you know, people driving without a license, or some super minor charge that they didn't want to deal with the police with. And so when they came along, they couldn't, you know, morally keep on driving. They got out, helped Doris, but didn't want to hang around to hand over their name, have their license plate checked, and so they just got away as quickly as possible. But as to who these 2 men actually were, we don't know. Screamer Flipnote was, as far as I can tell, a screamer video, which was this type of video in like the 2000s, the 2010s, which, as the name suggests, typically had a loud scream or bang in them, and they would normally be very, very calm, kind of lull you in, and then bah! Super loud, scary face or something. And this video was no different. It was of a animated loop of these guys just bopping their head to Justin Bieber's Baby in a car. And then, just as you're thinking, yeah, this is a pretty groovy song, bam, a pixelated, deformed man with just no eyes appears on screen and screams into your ears. And that was the video. So clearly a piece of fine art, but it is no longer available anywhere and is considered a piece of lost media. The serial killer on the Howard Stern show. So this was a guy who called up in 1997 and more or less confessed to being a serial killer. And I'll show little snippets of this if I can, but it's basically this guy who goes by the name Clay and calls and discusses with Howard and his co-host, as they basically are a little bit surprised, but they keep him on the line. They ask him questions about, you know, why do you kill? Who do you kill? When did you first do it? I guess trying to be somewhat entertaining for their viewers and somewhat to get information for the police, for the FBI.
Sometimes I ask them if they think it's dangerous doing what they're doing, if they're worried about things, and they'll laugh it off, and that just pisses me off.
Right. And then you go ahead and you kill them.
Yeah.
And this guy who's calling up honestly sounds a little relieved to get some of these things off his chest, which is not uncommon with killers. But who exactly this guy who's calling up was has never been determined.
I think I just do it for the sense of the power.
All right. Do you have sex with them first?
Yes, and
then what, you strangle them?
Once.
How else did you kill them?
Well, a few times, actually most times with a hammer.
And where do you do this primarily?
I've done it twice in a parking garage, and then the rest of the time's on the side of the road.
A bunch of people think that this might have been Russell Elwood, who was actually suspected of being the Storyville killer, or the Storyville Slayer, who was a serial killer who killed a bunch of women, mostly adult workers, around New Orleans around this sort of time. The Storyville Slayer himself has officially never been caught, and Russell himself was eventually sentenced to life in prison for a single murder, but not for the 12 people that the Storyville Slayer killed. But Russell was highly suspected of doing these killings. A few of the details between, Russell and Clay do kind of match up, but they said Russell would likely have been in police custody at the time of the call, so there is that side of it. Not completely impossible, I don't think, but quite unlikely maybe. And to this day, we don't know whether the phone call was a hoax perpetrated by Howard Stern, or if it was a hoax just by a random caller, or if it was an actual serial killer calling up to get stuff off his chest. And if he was an actual killer, we have no idea who he was, or if he's been caught, if he's still out there, if he's died somehow, or where he might be today. The Setagaya family massacre. So this was a case of unsolved murders involving the Miyazawa family in Setagaya in Japan. This was in the year 2000, and just before the new year, someone broke into the home of the Miyazawa family just before midnight, and they murdered 44-year-old Mikio, 41-year-old Yasuko, 8-year-old Nina, and 6-year-old Rei. And he, as I'm assuming it's a he, did this with a knife and with strangulation. And the killer then stayed inside the house for several hours until the bodies were eventually discovered. And he was thought to have entered in through the window, perhaps by cutting the outside screen, entering in, and then climbing in and strangling the son of the family in his room. And then when the dad came up, he stabbed the dad to death, and in doing this, he apparently broke his knife. So then he went downstairs, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and killed the mother and daughter. But then he just seemingly chilled inside of the house. Like, he stayed in the house for several hours, he drank 4 bottles of barley tea, and he ate a melon, 4 ice creams. He used the family computer for a little bit, and got a first aid kit in the house, treated his wounds, just all casual like. And he also used the toilet without flushing. Like, he wasn't careful whatsoever. He left behind DNA, he left behind fingerprints, hairs, he left behind the knife upstairs that he had entered the house with, and a scarf, a sweater, a hip bag, jacket, hat, gloves, and a handkerchief. And then he took a nap on the family sofa. So honestly, he seems like incredibly mentally deranged. And then sometime after this, he ended up leaving. Yasuko's mother came over to the house, and she found everyone dead. And so the police came, they started an investigation. They were actually able to track and find where the knife and the jacket were purchased from, and obviously what the killer had eaten the day before with his stuff in the toilet. They were able to collect his DNA, his fingerprints, and they found that the sweater that the man had left was one of only 130 made. But still, despite all of this evidence, the man seemingly wasn't in the system, and they were never able to find or identify the killer. And this case actually was one of the major cases in the drive behind the removal of the statute of limitations for murder. And I've brought this up many times on Japanese cases because their old statute of limitations was just absolutely insane. So before 2004, there was a 15-year statute of limitations. So if you killed someone and weren't caught after 15 years, you could walk right into the police station, hand over video footage of you murdering this person, give a full confession with DNA and all the evidence, and they legally couldn't even convict you of the crime because it was almost as if the crime had never even taken place. Now that makes sense for some things like shoplifting. You know, if you steal a candy bar when you're 12, I don't think it makes sense to prosecute someone for that crime 30 years later. But when it comes to murder, in my eyes, it should be unlimited. And as I said, before 2004 it was 15 years, and then they extended it to 25 years, and then partly because of this case, it was actually removed altogether. So it is unlimited now in Japan, which is very, very good. But this is still a horrific case, as it always is when children end up dying. And sadly, the monster who did all this has never been found. But rest in peace to the Miyazawa family. The sewer murders were these horrific, brutal killings of these young boys between the ages of 11 and 18 in the 1970s and 80s. And a few of these boys were thought to be in the adult worker industry, even though they weren't adults, which is very disturbing. But a lot of them were just vagrants, homeless kids, runaways sort of thing. And over these years, as many as 7 were found abandoned, killed, and beaten, handcuffed, hands behind their back. Sometimes they were stripped down, and they were found in and around sewage plants, sewage facilities, with some of them actually disturbingly thought to have been alive when they were dumped in there. And as you can imagine, with how messy and chaotic and crazy some of these sewage plants are, many of these boys weren't discovered for ages. And even when they were discovered, the sewage and the, rough and tumble had in some cases completely destroyed any evidence and completely destroyed some of the identification for these boys. Some of them it took years to identify, and one actually has never been identified. And police eventually came to the conclusion that whoever did this was probably a male in his sort of 40s to 50s. Maybe he was frustrated at his own sexuality, he was taking it out on these boys, and the sewage part of it was thought to be part humiliation to the boys. Like maybe he hated his own sexuality that much that he just thought to do the worst possible thing to them. And also, secondarily, it served as a good way to destroy evidence. It is a very messed up case. There was one suspect who was a 40-year-old storeman who had actually been convicted of luring young children and teens to his home and basically paying them for you-know-what. And apparently he was a pretty sick and twisted guy, but there just wasn't enough evidence in this particular case to convict him of these killings. So he could have been an entirely separate guy to the person who killed these boys, but that remains to be seen, and this entire case to this day has never been solved. Sherry Jarvis was a 14-year-old runaway girl from Minnesota who was found dead in 1980. Now, at the time that her body was found, it was found on the side of the road, having been violently beaten and brutally assaulted. And at the time, police couldn't actually get a positive identity on her. So it wasn't until the year 2020, 40 years later, that police were able to eventually get a solid DNA sample. They were able to track it back to other family members, and then through that they were able to ID Sherry Jarvis. And Sherry Jarvis was identified as a girl who, as I said, ran away in the 1980s, or in 1980 to be specific. And they collected a bunch of eyewitnesses that saw the girl while she was still alive, and she was, in the area, hitchhiking along the road, stopping off, asking people for directions, and then the body was found, with police determining that the killing took place no more than 6 hours before it was found. So whoever did this could not have been more than 6 hours away. And even though, as I said, they found the body just 6 hours after she was killed, she was a Jane Doe up until 2020, so 40 years after she was found. She was, as I said, assaulted, but not in the conventional way a guy might do it. Like, there wasn't any bodily fluids found at the scene, and it seemed that this person had just used a foreign object on her. So police were open at least to the idea of this being a female killer, but that is as far as the case went. The killer was never found, and I say this with all of my heart, rest in peace, Sherry. She seemed like a pretty cool kid. Her friends used to call her Tatty, like as a nickname. It seems like she ran away because she didn't have a great home life. She was tired of being moved around in the state's custody, but all in all, she seemed pretty cool. And then she apparently ran into one of the many, many monsters on this earth. Demons walking around disguised as people. And honestly, reading all of these cases makes me incredibly angry and a little fearful of just what types of people are out there. They're probably walking around among us. They seem fairly normal, and then something like this comes up and they just pounce at the opportunity and do the most evil thing possible. And it is mind-boggling, puzzling, but also genuinely does make me all kinds of upset. And as I said, rest in peace, Sherry. Silk henges are these super cool little structures, and they were discovered in South America in 2013. And they were dubbed silk henges because they look kind of like Stonehenge, but silk. And they consist of, as you can see, like a spire construct in the middle, and this construct in the middle actually contains spider eggs. And then it has these little, like, poles or fences all around it, seemingly guarding the main structure from any, passing bugs or anything. And as I said, we have no idea what type of spider actually makes these. They were found in 2013, and there were nearby some baby spiders, but baby spiders apparently aren't great if you want to identify the species of spider, and the DNA samples they all took, they came back kind of negative. They weren't able to determine a species, and these structures seem to be incredibly rare. So there is some unknown species of spider somewhere out there making these cool, gnarly little homes, structures, silk henges, if you will. You know, just an honest, down-to-earth house with a nice white little picket fence, and I just think that is super cool. But it is still an unsolved mystery. Unsolved spider mystery. Sneha and Philip. So this was a woman who went missing in New York around the World Trade Center during the time of the September 11th attacks. And she was a physician who had gone to med school, obviously to be a physician, but in med school she had met and started dating and was now married to a doctor named Rob Lieberman. And to paint Sneha's life kind of quite broadly, the couple were obviously quite well off. They were both doctors, they were living in New York, so they were doing fine in that regard, but romance-wise, their marriage was a little bit tenuous. Sneha herself had a mild to serious drinking problem, and there was some drama with her being late to work, with her not doing her job properly, and so she was let go from the place that she worked. She also tended to drink, stay out late at night, often with various people, not coming home, staying, places unknown to Ron. And she was last physically seen on CCTV camera on September 10th, and she was shopping at the time. And she had actually called her mother to say that she was going up to the World Trade Center, but more specifically to a restaurant on the World Trade Center, and this was to have dinner with her family. But this wasn't scheduled for really a few days. But it is always possible that for some reason she did actually go up there on September 11th. Maybe in the morning to check out the restaurant or to buy something, but that is just a theory, as she wasn't actually seen up on the tower. And so on September 10th, as I said, she was seen on CCTV camera. Then later on, Ron got home, Sneha wasn't in, which apparently wasn't too unusual for their relationship. So Ron just thought, whatever, I'll go to sleep. Sometimes she's out drinking, sometimes she's out all night. This was almost standard in their relationship at the time. I'm not saying they were happy with it, but it was fairly unsurprising. So he got up for work the next day, he went to work, the, September 11th attack ended up happening, and then when he eventually got back home, Sneha was still nowhere to be seen. She hadn't been in the apartment at all, no one else had heard from her or seen her, and so that is basically the mystery of where she went and what happened to her. Some people thought that because she was fairly nearby and she was a doctor, that she had perhaps volunteered to take care of injured people, after the attacks, and then she herself ended up getting injured maybe when the buildings collapsed, or she faked her death using these attacks as a cover-up in order to maybe change her name, move out of the area, get out of this marriage, or there was some foul play involving Ron killing her or someone else killing her, which honestly, for a lot of these theories, there's not really much evidence for them, so they are just theoretical. She was officially later declared the 2,751st victim of the 9/11 attacks, but what actually happened to her, we have no idea. The Sodder children. So to explain this case, we need to go back a little bit into the history of the Sodder family. And the father of the family, George Sodder, was born in Italy as Giorgio Sodu. And he moved to America at the age of 13 in 1908 and started working, slowly built up money, started a company, then started a family, got married, and over the years had 9 kids. And it was on one Christmas Eve in 1945 that the Sodder family was all at home. They were enjoying their Christmas as a family, and some of the Sodder family were asleep already, some were still up downstairs, the kids playing with toys, and some of the kids asked to stay up a little bit later because they already had some toys, they wanted to play with them. So the mom said, fine, you can stay up, but she headed up to bed. She said, don't be up too late, and she was awoken just after midnight by a phone call downstairs, and she went down there, answered the phone. It was just a random phone call, apparently, a random number that they didn't recognize, and on the other end was some lady who was just laughing and was clinking glasses. So a bit random. She put the phone down, but then she noticed that the lights downstairs were still on and the curtains hadn't been pulled, which the kids normally did before they went to sleep. So she thought this was a bit weird. She went into the living room, she pulled the curtains, turned off the lights. One of the kids was asleep on the couch and the rest were nowhere to be seen. But since these kids slept in the attic, the mum assumed that they had just gone up to bed, forgot to turn off the lights. So she did all that, went back to bed herself, and then was woken up shortly after by a bang on the roof, which she thought was strange, but she again went back to sleep. But then she was awoken a third time by the smell of smoke. And when she got up, she realized that the entire house was more or less on fire. So she woke up George, he in turn woke up the rest of the family. They all escaped out the front door. But this wasn't the entire family because they couldn't get up into the attic. It was something to do with the stairs or the ladder access being, destroyed or broken in the fire. So they got the rest of the family out, ran outside, and then George tried to go around and get access to the attic from down on the ground. So first he tried climbing up there, but that didn't really work. Then he tried to grab a ladder that was normally nearby, but for some reason they couldn't find the ladder. Then George and his son got their 2 trucks, and they were, planning to drive them up against the building and then use them to, climb up into the attic. But both of the vehicles, for some reason, wouldn't start, even though they were running perfectly fine just a few hours ago. Then they had this barrel of water, which they had planned to maybe knock over or use in some way to put the fire out, but they found that it was actually frozen solid. So by this point, they had failed every attempt to get up into the attic. The fire and the house were completely ablaze, and they ended up having to try 3 phones in order to get through to the firefighters. And when they did, because of World War II, the firefighters were short-staffed, and they didn't actually get out to the house until several hours later. So honestly, just an insane series of events. And the really strange thing about this case is that no bodies were ever found in the building. George and his wife and his other children obviously all got out, but his 5 remaining children, they weren't seen that night. Their bodies weren't found in the fire or in the remains. And the Sodder family, especially the parents at the time, believed that these children were killed on purpose, and the house was set ablaze by someone deliberately in order to get back at George for what exactly? Well, for apparently being quite vocally negative about Italy and about Mussolini. So as we covered earlier, George left Italy when he was quite young, around 13, but we never found out the exact reason for him leaving Italy, whether it was just family issues, or he wanted to be more free, or for financial opportunities, or perhaps it was something related to do with the mafia. And when he was in America, he was in a sort of Italian-American neighborhood. So there were a lot of Italian people, and some of them didn't take too kindly to him being critical of Italy and of their current leader, Mussolini. One salesman, for example, said that his entire house would burn down and his children would be destroyed if he didn't, buy his stuff. And it was felt that a few people in the community really hated him and his family just for these opinions and views that he had. And after the family had some time to, step back, to grieve, to settle everything else in their lives, they basically started to question everything about the official story of this case. They said that if the fire was started by, an electrical fire, then why were all the lights in the rest of the house still working? Like, surely if this was an electrical fire, it might have tripped a fuse and all the power, all the lights in the house would have went out. And the phone line to the house that was thought to have been actually burned through in the fire, upon further inspection, seemed to have been actually purposefully cut. And strangely enough, they eventually did track down the person who seemingly cut it, who was a man that someone said they had witnessed stealing something from the Sodder family's home. And then they found this man. He said, yes, that was me that cut the cable. And basically, I was just in the garden, in the yard. I was stealing some, bits and bobs. And I thought this was the power cable. So I cut it, but it ended up being the phone cable. And that brings up a lot of questions. The main one being, why, if you're trying to steal something from outside, would you even consider cutting the power cable? It seems like not a very covert thing to do, so that was weird. And as I said, no remains or bones were found in the fire. The ladder was found a short distance away from where it was left, which explains why they weren't able to find it on that morning. And the cars wouldn't start that morning, which are all very suspicious details. And eventually, they ended up finding witnesses that said that they saw some of the Sodder children in a car that night outside of the Sodder home, and the car was just driving along away from the home. And they also apparently found a lady in a diner who said that she had served these children, who were accompanied by some Italian adults. There was also another witness that said that they had seen someone throwing balls of fire, they said, at the Sodder home, which might tie into Jenny's account of being woken up, hearing something thump onto the roof, rolling down, and could possibly be how the fire actually started. And there was an inquest to determine legally how the fire had started, and the jury voted that it was an electrical fire. But strangely enough, one of the men on that jury was actually the man, the salesman, who said that George's home would be burnt down and all of his children destroyed, which may mean something, it may mean nothing. Most of the family, as I said, believed that the children actually did survive that night and were stolen, were taken away perhaps by someone in Italy, maybe the mafia, and then they grew up in Italy far away from their parents. But it is also possible that the children did actually die in that fire, as apparently the search that was done the following morning by the fire department wasn't super thorough, and less than a week later, the Sodder family actually kind of buried the property. They said it was causing too much heartbreak seeing the fire and the destroyed buildings, so they basically just bulldozed it, covered it with soil, and turned it into a memorial for the children. So, is it possible they died in the fire and then were buried in the soil, never found? I think probably absolutely possible. And with all the connections and the strange things that happened, I think it is an absolutely tragic event that took place, and especially for the parents to actually go through that. They probably had blamed themselves, or they couldn't face the reality that they were to blame for their children dying, or that their children had even died in the first place. And so I can see them very strongly holding on to the belief that their children were still alive, someone else had caused this, and trauma and grief will make you do and see some crazy things. The youngest of the children, Sylvia, actually died in 2021, and a lot of the family is still to this day holding on to that belief that, you know, their family is still somewhere alive, or probably not at that age, but that their family didn't die on that day in that fire. And it is honestly really sad, because in my eyes, some of the family likely died. The siblings and the children all went through grief. The parents probably went through the most grief, and then those children carried that grief onto their children, and it seems to have caused a massive generational wound. So very sad case, but a ton of details honestly on it, and let me know what you think down below. The South Bend Osco store murders. So this is a case that took place in South Bend, Indiana, when on one August morning in 1990, police were called to an Osco pharmacy, and when they stepped inside, they found the bodies of 3 employees lying in pools of blood, dead. These were the store manager Scott Dick, a pharmacist Tracy Holvert, and a clerk Connie Zalewski. And obviously everything was cordoned off, an investigation was started, and it wouldn't be until 10 years later when a man named Christopher Allen would finally be charged with this triple murder. He was a former employee at Osco, and he had been fired months earlier for apparently stealing, and so the prosecution said that he had come back, taken his revenge on his former employees, and killed all 3 workers. So the trial was set, it took place, the jurors in the end couldn't agree, and so there was a mistrial. And then there was a second trial. Christopher was found guilty and sentenced to 144 years, 48 years for each murder. But then this verdict was overthrown due to a technicality. And then a third trial took place, but that was also a mistrial. And the fourth trial never actually happened. The police, I guess, were convinced that they couldn't really get a conviction. Maybe the second time was a fluke or something. And so, as sometimes happens, they don't press any more charges. Maybe they go and try and form a stronger case and then charge them later on. But in this case, that never actually took place, at least not to this day, and so no one has actually been charged and convicted for these crimes. And did Christopher Allen actually commit these murders? I mean, it's likely, maybe even probable, but it's hard to say. His defense basically say that the corrupt police more or less just focused on him. You know, he said there were other valid suspects, and they didn't follow up on them at all. They just focused fully on Christopher. And his ex-girlfriend said that at the time, he was at home with her. So it's kind of hard to say, but it is still a horrible, brutal case that as of right now, is not yet solved. So grab a drink. My choice today is strawberry kefir, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. Southern Narwhal. So narwhals are this awesome creature, the unicorns of the sea, as some people call them. And fun fact, this horn that comes out of the narwhal isn't actually a horn. It is a tooth. And they are one tooth that grows super, super long. It just like keeps growing. It's kind of spike shape, and it actually grows out of the narwhal's gum and kind of looks like a horn. And this tooth is kind of like a sensor to the narwhal. You know, it detects water temperature, it detects saltiness, and it is used kind of like a probe in the water to help these narwhals better understand where they are, their surroundings, etc. So yeah, super cool. But narwhals are typically native to the Arctic, and not really anywhere else. But this entry is regarding what has been dubbed the Southern Narwhal, which are the supposed narwhal sightings that have been seen kind of in the Antarctic as opposed to the Arctic. So like the complete opposite side of the planet. These sightings go back as far as like the 1600s, with various sailors, captains, explorers, all seeing what they described as, you know, a horned aquatic animal, which upon closer inspection seemed to be a narwhal. And I mean, these could have been mistaken identities. They could have been regular whales that people had mistaken for narwhals, or they could have just been some other type of sea creature, or perhaps a previously thought extinct animal, like the Adobenacetops, which likely died out like 5 million years ago, but it looks pretty gnarly. Or they could have actually been a type of narwhal living in the Antarctic space that we have just yet to discover. Strangelets are something we covered before in the space iceberg, but just the concept of them is absolutely insane. And I won't get super into them and the details of them, because as I said, the whole concept is very, very advanced, and it kind of hurts my head just thinking about it. And I will simplify some things, but the gist will still be there. But basically all of matter, so this mug, for example, they are made up of these tiny little things, you know, atoms, and within the atoms are even smaller things called protons and neutrons. And if you go even further than that, the protons and neutrons are made up of these tiny particles called quarks, and quarks tend to be quite strongly bound to each other. You know, if there's 3 quarks in a bundle, they just stick together really hard. It's kind of hard for them to, you know, break off and react. And actually, the stronger you pull against them, trying to pull them apart, the more energy they exert in holding themselves together. And there are a few different types of quarks, which we won't really get into them, but they all have slightly different properties and slightly different levels of stabilization. So for example, the up and down type of quark, they're normally the most stable quark. And the other ones, they tend to be quite unstable, which means if and when they exist, they don't tend to last in that form for very long. And I hope this is not too complex right off the bat. But this entry is regarding something called a strange quark, which normally strange quarks are quite unstable, so they can't really exist for very long in any substantial way, unless they're in this hypothetical situation. And the situation is inside something called a quark star, which again I covered in the space iceberg. But this is basically a version of a neutron star. So if you can imagine in a really big, really low pressure star, it would, you know, maybe suck in all of this stuff, rocks and material. But then as the star gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the pressure inside gets more and more intense, these physical things like metals and rocks would eventually break apart into, you know, individual atoms. And then eventually, when the pressure got so intense, the bonds of the atoms themselves would, you know, break apart and become individual neutrons. And that is where we get the name neutron star from. But as we mentioned earlier, these neutrons are in turn made up of smaller particles called quarks. And the idea is that a quark star would be a type of neutron star that's even smaller and more compact. And the pressure would actually break apart these neutrons into their individual quarks. And so on the inside of one of these stars, it would basically just be a sea of quarks, with the pressure being too intense for atoms or even neutrons to form. And now that we've got that science lesson out of the way, it is theorized that in these conditions, perhaps strange quarks would be able to survive, they'd be able to thrive, and kind of stay in a steady form. And what's interesting about strange quarks is that they are kind of the most strong quark, or the most attractive quark in a way, where they are actually able to convert other quarks into themselves. So if you imagine this sea of quarks within this star, a few of the quarks turn to strange quarks, they convince other quarks around them to become strange quarks as well, and then eventually, slowly, the entire interior of this star is just filled with strange quarks. And this is what is referred to as strange matter. Now, as I said, quark stars are somewhat hypothetical, and the idea of the interior of one of these quark stars being fully strange quarks is also somewhat hypothetical and mostly theoretical, as we can't really take one of these stars and, crack them open, take a look inside. But the idea is that if you take these quark stars and maybe you have a collision with another quark star, they smash into each other, and then little bits of this strange matter fly off into the universe, and these little bits would be called strangelets because, strange quarks. But it is theorized that these little strangelets could become highly contagious. So, these tiny particles, they go flying through space, they hit into a planet, maybe Mars or something like that, and then a chain reaction would start to take place, where all of the atoms, all of the particles that make up Mars would slowly start to get converted into strange matter, until eventually the entirety of Mars is just made up of strange matter. And this would spread like a disease throughout the universe, like an ooze or something, slowly converting all matter in the universe into strange matter. So yeah, I don't mean to scare you, any more than is necessary, of course. And sorry if this entry was a little bit mind-boggling. It's a very complex topic, and I'm not the best at explaining these sorts of things. But as I said, a lot of it is theoretical. We're not even fully sure if quark stars do exist. So you can probably rest easy for tonight. But yeah, what a strange entry. Super tasks. So the idea of super tasks is very mind-boggling, honestly, but I'll try and explain them briefly without anyone's heads blowing up. And Vsauce has a fantastic video on this if you want to check it out down below. I'll put a little link down there. But for this entry, imagine you had a cake. And for this example, this cake looks exactly like a candle, but this cake would have a certain volume of cake, so how much cake is in the cake, and it would also have a certain height. Now let's say you cut this cake in half and then stacked the cake on top of the other half. The volume of the cake wouldn't change, you haven't taken away or added any cake, but the height of the cake will have doubled. So pretty simple so far. And then say you do that again, you take the top layer, you cut it in half, you stack it on top of the cake, and you keep doing this over and over again. You keep cutting the top layer, stacking it up, cutting the top layer, stacking it up, and you do this hypothetically an infinite amount of times. At the end of this, you will have an infinitely high cake, but its mass will be finite. The mass will be whatever mass you started with in the original cake. You could hypothetically eat this cake within just a few minutes because the mass of it will be finite, and yet, in theory, you could stretch this cake from one side of the universe to the other, as it would have infinite height. And this would be called a super solid, so a finite mass or volume with infinite properties, be that height, width, depth, length, etc. And super tasks are basically this, but for actions instead of objects. So say you have a jar or an infinitely large cup, and you start throwing in jelly beans one by one. By the time you've thrown in an infinite amount of jelly beans, there will have passed an infinite amount of time. So that's pretty straightforward. But what if you threw in one jelly bean, and then you waited 1 minute, and then you threw in another jelly bean, and then waited only 30 seconds, and then threw in another, waited 15 seconds, threw in another, waited 7.5 seconds, and you kept halving the amount of time waited? The total time in this sequence would never exceed 2 minutes. But in the end, you will have thrown in an infinite amount of jelly beans, or completed an infinite amount of tasks in just 2 minutes, or a finite amount of time. Now, this topic can get very complex and quite interesting. If you, for instance, as you're throwing the jelly beans in, if you alternate between red jelly bean and blue jelly bean, then at the end of this infinite sequence, what will have been the last jelly bean you threw in? Would it be a blue jelly bean or a red one? It kind of has to be one color, right? Because you've only been throwing in red and blue beans, and assumedly you have stopped because the 2 minutes is up. But how can there be a last action or a last digit in an infinite sequence. If there was a last, number or digit in the sequence, then it would imply that the sequence is countable, and this would mean it wouldn't be infinity. So very fun concept, very interesting idea. If you want to go a bit deeper into these concepts, into this theory, into some of these ideas and problems, as I said, absolutely check out the Vsauce video on this. And I absolutely love this stuff, but as I said, it can get quite a bit complicated sometimes. So yeah, as I said, fantastic entry, but we'll leave it there for now. Susie Lamplugh was an estate agent who went missing in Fulham, London in 1986 while attending a house viewing. So on the day of her disappearance, Susie had penciled into her diary, or her work schedule, that she was to meet a man named Mr. Kipper outside of a house that he was looking to buy, number 37 Shorrolds Road in Fulham. There were multiple eyewitnesses on the day that put her outside of the house waiting for this man, and then the eyewitnesses say she basically wasn't around, and then she was seen leaving the house with a man. So it was assumed that she had went there, waited for the man had arrived, they both went in together, looked around, did the house viewing, and then left the house. And the eyewitnesses of this man were somewhat strange. He was a white man with dark hair, with a dark, pretty smart suit, and he was carrying a bottle of champagne wrapped in like a cute little ribbon. And then the eyewitnesses said they saw the pair fighting. They were having a little bit of a row. They both got into Susie's car, and then she drove away quite erratically, and they had seemingly carried this fight with them while they were in the car. And then this is where the sightings of the pair start to get a little strange. So they were seen, first of all, driving away from the house, together in Susie's car. And then there were other sightings of Susie quite hastily driving and parking up outside this other house, which was another house for sale on Stevenage Road. And then there were sightings of Susie in the passenger seat in a black BMW. And she was apparently screaming quite frantically, hitting the horn, and I guess no one alerted any police or came to her rescue or anything. But this was also around Stevenage Road, and this black BMW was also seen parked up around the initial house viewing on Shorrolds Road. And after Susie didn't return to work that afternoon, her colleagues did report her missing to the police, and when police went round to the flat, the one that she was viewing with the man, they couldn't find much besides eyewitnesses. So they went round to Stevenage Road, where the other house was, and they found there her car abandoned, and it was seemingly hastily abandoned. The driver's side door was open, the handbrake wasn't engaged, the key was missing from the car, and it looked like the car driver's seat had been kind of adjusted for someone that wasn't Susie, and her purse was also found in the car. So very suspicious set of circumstances. It is theorized quite likely that the black BMW belonged to the killer, and as I said, witnesses initially saw Susie kind of drive off with this man in the car, and they seemed to be having a row, and then Susie's car was later found outside of this other house. And as I mentioned, it seemed to have been parked up quite hastily. The door was unlocked, the handbrake wasn't on. So what's thought maybe to have happened is she drove away from the house with this man in her car. Maybe the man ended up incapacitating her somehow, and then perhaps he took over the car, adjusted the seat, drove up outside of this house, and then somehow transported her into his car, into the black car, perhaps as she was fighting, as she was struggling. When she was in the car, as I said, she was screaming frantically, she was hitting the car horn, but no rescue ever came. And when this black BMW disappeared from the scene, Susie was never seen again. Quite quickly in the investigation, they ruled out her boyfriend as a suspect, and they did a search of her flat, a search and investigation and interviews with her work colleagues, and they found that someone had left Susie a bouquet of roses at her work just a few days ago. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the eyewitnesses said that the man outside of the flat, he had, a bottle of champagne with a nice little bow on it. So the champagne with the, bouquet of roses, it seemed like these were connected, and whoever it was a bit of a, schmoozer. And after doing some further investigations, they stumbled across a man named John Cannon. He was known for being a bit of a schmoozer. He fit the description, he was in the area at the time, and he was a previously convicted assaulter who had, assaulted and beaten his girlfriend just a few years ago because she had tried to leave him, which, massive red flag. Then he threatened a shopkeeper just a year later and then actually assaulted her. And at the time of the disappearance of Susie Lamplugh, he was actually on day release and was working as a porter as I said, around the Fulham area. He was known for his ability to kind of attract and to woo women, and for being quite, a charmer, quite charismatic, quite a romantic kind of guy. And he was known for buying chocolates, roses, drinks, etc. for women that he liked. And he was known for socializing quite a bit, for visiting wine bars in the area, which there was one just across the road from where Susie worked. And he had apparently told his fellow inmates that he had a, new uptown girlfriend that he called Susu, or, Susie. And if that wasn't enough evidence, he also owned a black BMW. And when he was questioned about this later, he said that yes, he did own the black BMW, but he had actually bought it from a man who was responsible for the murders of Shirley Banks and Susie Lamplugh and another girl. And when police said, okay, is that man you? He apparently nodded, but later denied that he had ever done this, fully recanted his entire confession interview. Oh, and Shirley Banks, the woman I just mentioned, she was actually his girlfriend, who John was later convicted of killing and sentenced to life in prison. So yeah, it was absolutely fucking John, with even the police going so far as to say, yes, we believe it was 100% John, but we just don't have the, evidence and resources to convict him. So yeah, I think this happens quite a bit where someone is convicted of another crime. They're convicted of one murder, they're put in prison for life, and so the police don't really put resources or bother, convicting them of anything else, because it's like, what, we're going to waste resources finding evidence, doing interviews, and then setting up a trial, wasting the court's time, all just to put him in prison for a second life sentence. It might make sense to use the resources on actual active criminals, but what likely happened in this case was he was around the area. Maybe he saw her, as he was in the wine bar looking across the road. He saw this pretty lady at the front desk of this estate agent's, and then he slowly started to fall in love with her. He tried to kind of love bomb her, buy her gifts, buy her flowers, and then maybe he made some big proposal to her while she was at the house viewing, come and run away with me sort of thing. And when she denied his advances, he did whatever he did. Kidnapped her, took her away, and very likely ended up killing her. Susie herself was a young, very smart, attractive lady with a ton of potential, and John took that all away from her and took Susie away from the rest of the world. Terrence Williams and Felipe Santos. So these were these two men who went missing from Naples, Florida in 2003 and 4 in these very similar, very strange circumstances. And the last time either of these men were seen was when they were on two separate occasions seen getting into the back of this policeman's car. And this was a police deputy named Steve Corkins of the local county sheriff's office. And with Felipe Santos, he stopped Felipe, pulled him over, and then arrested him for driving without a license. And then just a few months later, Terrence was arrested for also driving without a license. And on both occasions, the men were never seen again. Steve's account of what happened was, he said basically that he changed his mind on both occasions. He said, yeah, I went to arrest them, I threw them in the back of the car, and I was going to drive to the police station, but on the way, as I was speaking to these young men, they kind of tugged on my heartstrings. I felt a little sorry for them. They weren't really as bad as they seemed. So he said on both occasions, he was like, alright, as long as you don't do it again, you're kind of free to go. And he said he dropped Santos off at a local convenience store, and then that was it. He never really saw him again. And this was even though Santos was actually on his way to work, and his work wasn't too far from the convenience store. So it seems strange that he would drop him off at the convenience store. Surely if you had changed your mind and you were going out of your way to help the guy, you might just drive a little bit further and drop him off at work. So very suspicious. And then a few months later, 27-year-old Terrence Williams was driving along, and he was driving under the influence. He didn't have a license. He didn't have a vehicle registration. So all terrible things, granted. But basically, from the family's perspective, Terrence went out, he was on his way home, and then he just kind of disappeared. So his family thought this was a bit strange. They went to investigate where Terrence might be, what might have happened to him, and they found that his car had been towed outside of this local cemetery, and the tow report and request was signed by Officer Stephen Corkins. So they called the police station, they requested to speak to Steve Corkins, and they found that, very strangely, he hadn't filed an official arrest, nor did he file an official incident report for whatever happened that morning. And when they spoke to Steve directly, he said that he had no recollection, no memory of anything happening that morning. He was like, towing outside a cemetery? That wasn't me. I have no idea what you're talking about. But upon further investigation, they found these eyewitnesses around the cemetery, and these eyewitnesses were able to place Officer Corkins at the scene. So then the family went back to Corkins, and eventually he was like, yeah, I do remember being there that morning. But he said he basically pulled Terrence over for reckless driving. Terrence said that he was late for work. And then Officer Corkins, you know, the lovable, kind guy he is, he said, all right, you know, I want to arrest you, but if you're late for work, I kind of need to help you out. He said, jump in the back of my car, I'll drive you to this convenience store. And apparently Terrence had told him that he worked in the convenience store. So he went, he dropped Terrence at the convenience store, and then he drove back to the car, checked the license, checked all of that, and only then found that Terrence was driving without a license. And he said he just felt tricked by Terrence, like he was such a nice young man. I really trusted him, and then he, you know, bamboozled me. What a dastardly trick. Which, yeah, absolutely believable. And then Steve said that he later called this convenience store to, you know, check that Terrence got there fine. And the convenience store apparently told him that Terrence didn't work there. They don't know who Terrence is. And so Terrence had fooled this police officer once again. Except there was like zero evidence that Terrence or Corkins had ever gone to the convenience store. There was no eyewitnesses that said that they were there. The camera footage didn't show the cop car or Terrence or Corkins there. Corkins and the convenience store's phone records didn't show a call to the convenience store. And so, as with Santos, the last time that Terrence was ever seen was getting into the back of Corkins' car. And more information started to come out when they did a further deep dive into it. So during his recorded dispatch call to get the car towed, Corkins said that he basically came to the scene, he saw this abandoned car, and then he's on the phone saying, yeah, you know, I just came here, found an abandoned car, it's kind of in the way of traffic. If you can come tow it, that would be fantastic. Which, that's very suspicious. He never mentioned in the call that it was abandoned because he had actually stopped Terrence. He never mentioned Terrence. He never mentioned pulling him over for, you know, reckless driving. And it was found out that Corkins himself had likely moved the car for some reason. And they theorized that when Terrence was pulled over, when he parked up, he was, you know, in a normal parking spot, you know, out of the way of traffic that didn't really require a towing. And so maybe after this whole ordeal, Corkins got in his car, drove it a little bit into traffic in order to justify the towing. So yeah, this Corkins guy is looking incredibly suspect. And after both disappearances, you know, in the hours following these disappearances, Corkins was apparently missing for around about 2 hours each time. So investigators thought this was a little bit suspicious. They ended up bringing in the FBI, as they normally do with internal investigations like this. And the FBI searched Corkins' home, they searched his car, they had sniffer dogs and all of that, and nothing really turned up. And Corkins was eventually fired from his job, but he was never charged for the disappearances or murders or anything regarding these two men. Now, the main theory is that Corkins, you know, picked them up, ended up killing them for whatever reason, and then disposing of the bodies. Another theory is regarding something called starlighting, which is where if you're in a small town and you see someone who's, you know, unruly, they're a wrong'un coming into your town causing trouble, you don't really arrest them, you don't kill them, you don't do anything, but you simply pick them up, drive way out of town, and then just drop them off there. Basically just kind of getting bad people away from your town, which is a practice that has actually been proven to kind of regularly happen, at least in the past with policemen, where on a few occasions some American Indians have actually died from this, where, you know, they're picked up, brought way outside of town, and then they're in the middle of a forest or desert or something, you know, in the middle of winter or in the middle of summer, and they just end up dying from exposure. So that's one theory as to what might have happened. But if this were the case, you'd think one of them would turn up somewhere. You'd think either their body would turn up, or they'd get in contact with their family, or something would happen. Or one theory that is kind of pro Corkins is that he did genuinely just drop them off at these, you know, convenience stores, and they just ended up fleeing for whatever reason. You know, maybe they used it as an excuse to escape their family, escape their responsibilities, or they wanted to avoid further problems with the law. You know, if they had arrest warrants or they were doing stuff illegally, they used this as an excuse to jump ship and disappear, which I think that theory is very unlikely, and I think the starlighting one is slightly more likely, but still quite unlikely. And I also think Steve Corkins is suspicious as all get out, but he has never been charged for these crimes, and so these are still open cases to this day. The murder of Eva Roy. So this took place in the year 1918, when Eva Roy was just 14 years old, when she was left home alone when her father went into town for work, and when he came back home, she was nowhere to be seen. A search was soon started, and hours later, Eva was found dead, tied to a tree, having seemingly been abused, tortured, and killed. And a lot of the evidence in this case was sadly kind of destroyed at the scene, and this was by, well-meaning neighbors who didn't like seeing Eva in this way. So they said, this is ridiculous. They took her body, they clothed her, they washed her, they cleaned her up. They wanted her to be, somewhat dignified, cleaned up, not half naked tied to a tree. But in doing this, they obviously removed and destroyed a ton of the evidence. They contaminated almost all the evidence on Eva's body. They washed away everything else. They changed her clothes. They were walking around the tree, so the soil and the actual scene was contaminated. And police at the time, while they were investigating, they got these sniffer dogs, and they got the scent, or at least a scent, at the crime scene. And the dogs slowly sniffed their way across this field and came to a man named Lou Hall, who was a neighbor. He was a local laborer, and so police immediately arrested Lou. They tried to charge Lou for the crime twice, but he was acquitted in both trials, and so officially the case of Eva is still to this day unresolved. There are also, as a side mystery, these kind of rumors, these experiences that people have had of Eva haunting the local area, and these sightings of Eva are often seen at night. They're of Eva or a girl kind of draped in black, whispering, I'm Eva, and asking or begging the people to help her. So as I said, that's a side mystery at least. But as for the original case, the original mystery, this brutal murder and torture of this 14-year-old girl, it was sadly never solved. The worst movie ever's lone visitor. So this is in relation to the worst movie ever. And no, I'm not talking about The Room, which is a great film, or even Birdemic, which is, that's something special altogether, I think. But this was literally the title of this film, the worst movie ever. And it was a purposefully bad film made in 2011. And it also has the record for the worst grossing film of all time, at least in its opening weekend, with a box office performance of, get this, just a single ticket. So in all the theaters they opened at all across America, just a single person bought a ticket. So they grossed a total of $11. And basically, this mystery is we have no idea who that single person is or was. Why they chose to see the film on its midnight release. Did they plan to see the film? Was this in advance? Or did they just stumble across the theater? Maybe they were a stoned college kid and they just thought, yeah, this is a great laugh. Let me just buy a ticket for this film. It'd honestly be kind of great to, find the person to interview them, ask them a few questions, kind of paint the scene. But yeah, for this one, maybe we'll find out. If we do find out, it might be a little hard to believe them that they were that one person, unless they have a receipt or a, film ticket or something. But yeah, this kind of makes me want to check out the film, which it honestly sounds pretty bad, which is good. I don't know. Tombs of the Unknown Soldiers. So this is kind of a bittersweet entry, and naturally in wars, as you can imagine, there are a ton of what are called unknown soldiers. So these are soldiers that end up dying, either they're shot or blown up or die in some other way, and for whatever reason they can't be identified. So they are typically dubbed unknown soldiers. In the past, often they had trouble kind of burying them, because do you just do individual graves for all these unknown people? And who's really gonna visit unknown graves? If you don't know who's down there, you don't know where they're from. Typically people just go to the graves of their own loved ones. And so this was a thing that was kind of mainly started in World War I. It became mainstream all over the world after World War I. But before this, there was obviously tombs of unknown soldiers. But since World War I, it has kind of become popular all around the world in various countries, where you commemorate all of these unknown soldiers with one big memorial. So the idea for a lot of these is that you take one or many bodies of unknown soldiers, you bury them in this tomb, you have a memorial attached to it, and this is kind of representative of all of the unknown soldiers that die from that country. And obviously we don't know the identities of these unknown soldiers, you know, the physical ones that are actually buried in this tomb, as if we did know their identities, then they wouldn't be unknown soldiers. So I said it's bittersweet because it is kind of nice that they are commemorating unknown soldiers. You know, it is a place you can go, pay your respects to them, but it is obviously bitter in that so many soldiers end up dying, you know, way too many. And of the ones that die, way too many of them are unknown. It's bad enough them being killed, but them not being able to be buried, their family not being able to pay respects to them, that all just piles onto the heartbreak and tragedy. The Umo case is, well, that's a cool cover. But the Umo case was this case of apparent aliens, and they came from the planet Umo. And they communicated with aliens not by talking with them, not by telepathy, but by writing letters and making phone calls. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds insane. It probably is insane. Like, why not just use Facebook messages at this point? But this whole case, this whole entry kind of has very mixed reviews. You know, if you're a believer, then you kind of wholeheartedly believe this. You believe that the information in these letters is genuinely from aliens, and it is all, you know, encoded, highly advanced, highly useful mathematics, medical stuff, space details, numbers, names, concepts. Whoa. But if you don't believe this, then a lot of this stuff is just incoherent, rambling nonsense made up by someone with clearly too much time and seemingly creativity on their hands. And this whole case and the letters, etc., do have some interesting information in that it is said does line up with some, you know, real life events. And the believers of this have said that the information is too, you know, accurate, too detailed to be a coincidence. So it must be from aliens. But it has also been labeled kind of a hoax, kind of a fraud, even by actual, you know, alien fanatics, UFO fans. And so, yeah. Let me know what you believe on this one. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. Ursula Herrmann was a 10-year-old girl who went missing while on her bike in Bavaria, Germany in 1981. She was, at the time, riding on her bicycle riding home, and this journey was normally like a 10-minute journey, but after 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, she failed to show up, her parents alerted the police, and a search was soon started. And the police, they started the search, they went to the area that she had gone missing from, and they found more or less nothing. And that was kind of it. They didn't really have any leads to go on, they didn't have any suspicious connections, they didn't have any evidence to go off. The whole case was kind of stalled. And then 2 days later, these strange calls were made to Ursula's parents' home. You know, there was no voice on these calls, there was seemingly no person on the other end of it. There were just recordings of this piece of music from this radio ad, and then it would play, and then the phone call would just cut out. Then after 3 days, a ransom note appeared at the family home, and the note was demanding 2 million Deutschmarks, equivalent to around $3.5 million US in today's money. And then another ransom note was dropped off, and this note was demanding even more money and had instructions on how to deliver the money, but with no location for the drop-off. And then absolutely nothing. This was the last communication received from the kidnappers, and it wasn't until more than a week later, while searching the forest, that they came across a metal box in the ground, and they managed to open it. They found hooked up lights, they found blankets, food, books, a little radio, and Ursula Herrmann, who had seemingly died from suffocation just a few hours after being put in the box. It seemed like the ventilation pipes that were set up to try and give Ursula air, it seemed like they were blocked off at the top due to these kind of wet leaves being stuck into them. And this maybe kind of explained why the communication had stopped from the kidnappers. You know, it seemed like they had kidnapped Ursula, put her in the box, had these ransom notes sent, and then while trying to keep Ursula alive, they had accidentally killed her by blocking off the vents. And so with no Ursula, they had nothing to bargain with, and they cut off all communications. A few people in this case were considered suspects, with one man and his wife actually being arrested for this crime, but they were later acquitted in court, meaning that this case has for the last 45 years or so remained unsolved. UVB-76, nicknamed the Buzzer, is a shortwave radio station that broadcasts a short buzz buzz sound at approximately 25 beats per minute. Bzz, bzz. I feel like that's the dance that bees do. You know, quick, turn the radio to bee jazz. And BPM obviously stands for buzzes per minute. And this station is broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when it's not buzzing, sometimes it'll play Russian voices saying Russian things. And we have no real idea who owns the radio station or what it's used for. It is very likely something to do with Russia, with the Russian government, with probably the Russian military, but we're not super certain on that. And some people think that the buzzing is used as a deterrent to, you know, keep people off this channel. So if you or me want to use the channel for communication for some reason, you know, we're trying to talk to each other, super important, but then every few seconds you just hear buzz. It'd get super annoying super quickly. So that's one theory, that these buzzes is to stop other people being on the radio station. Another theory is that this buzzing station acts kind of like a dead man switch for Russia. So you can imagine a regular switch where you press the button to activate something. A dead man switch would be where you have to actually release the switch in order to trigger it. So if you're alive, you're holding the switch and nothing goes off. But if you were to kill that person, they would die, release the switch, and then that would trigger whatever it is. So one theory said that the constant buzzing was, you know, evidence that this Russian radio station was still around, and that if anyone bombed Russia, hit the radio station, the buzzing would stop, and then this would act as a dead man switch to launch nukes, you know, all around the world from Russia, which is a bit of a wild theory that's also kind of been disproven, because apparently the broadcast does stop buzzing every now and then, and no nukes have since been launched. There's other theories that say that the random speaking, you know, the random Russian voices aren't really anything important, but are just a way to keep, you know, Russian workers, or Russian radio workers, attentive to the radio station. So say you had this radio station, which they have, and I tell you, okay, sometime in the next few years maybe I'm gonna release some super vital information over this radio, and you have to listen at all times because you have no idea when it's coming. But to make sure that you're actually listening, I'm going to randomly broadcast these voices, and every time I broadcast a voice, you need to be there, you need to listen, you need to write down whatever it said, and then I will come and check. So maybe it's to stop people just being like, oh, you know, nothing ever comes out of this radio station, and to stop them being lazy and not listening, which I kind of like that theory. But yeah, the broadcasts are still playing, the buzzing never stops, and it is still full of mystery. The volcanic eruption of 416 AD. So this refers to a book written in 1869 by Java poet and writer, and if there are any people from Java watching this, please comment down below how I say this name, but his name is Radin Nabahi Rangawasita. Yeah, this is probably the worst one so far, but this is a huge book documenting as best he could the entire history of Java, and he basically used a bunch of ancient texts, you know, piecing together lost storylines and forgotten events. It is really quite an epic history book, but one event referred to in the book was this giant explosion, this giant eruption of Mount Capi, which the name Capi is no longer in use, so we don't know for certain exactly what mountain it was, but people have kind of pieced together clues, pieced together evidence, and they think Capi might very well refer to Mount Krakatoa. And so these texts tell of this giant eruption of Krakatoa in the year 416 AD, even though all of the evidence that we have gathered from almost everywhere else says that Krakatoa actually erupted in 535 AD, so over 100 years later. So, I mean, did he just get the dates wrong? Or did we perhaps get the dates wrong? Or were there actually two eruptions 100 years apart? Or was he referring to actually another mountain, you know, another volcano? And it's kind of hard to say. It's a super interesting case. I will leave an incredible write-up down in the description below. But the guy who wrote it, Cherry Blossom 724, which... cool name, by the way. But he notes that after the 535 eruption, some of the evidence that we have for the 535 eruption is that the script writings and the activities, etc., diminished greatly in quantity over the next like 20 years, which means in that period of 20 years, something clearly destructive, catastrophic happened, that it affected the amount of stuff being written. Whereas in the years around 416 AD, no such decline in writings happened. Meaning that either, he says, something didn't happen around then, or it was really so minor that it didn't affect things like the 535 eruption. So yeah, super fascinating entry. I absolutely love all of this ancient history type stuff. Or should I say, I absolutely lava it. You know, lava, eruptions, volcanoes. Oh boy, that was terrible. The Wailing of Wilga Waterhole is kind of like this ghost story of this watering hole in Australia. And there have been many accounts and tales of this watering hole, of people hearing these deathly screams coming from it. And there are some tales that say that there was this boy who had died of thirst around this watering hole, and he currently haunts the entire area. There were other tales that told of this giant massacre that happened there, and all of the dead in this area have stayed here to haunt the area, and they just screech and scream in the middle of the night or at anyone who passes by. And the watering hole is currently on private land, so it's a little hard to investigate it. You know, you'll have to trespass to do any real research. But yeah, very spooky entry. White holes. So a black hole, as you might know, is a region of space-time, or, you know, matter that is so condensed that it pulls everything around it into itself, even light. So you can imagine something like this mug. It has technically gravity, but it is so weak, being only this mass. Our moon has gravity, so you can actually, you know, fly up there, land on it without flying away. Our Earth obviously has gravity. We have the moon spinning around it. And the sun, as you can imagine, has even more gravity. But what happens is, as you get larger and larger, so you have our sun here with X amount of gravity, then if it becomes a sun like this big, it's even more gravity. But once you get bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually the sun would actually collapse in on itself, because the pressure in the center is so great that it starts pulling in all of this matter, which makes it even more dense, which increases its gravity even more, and so it just turns into an endless loop and sucks everything in around it. And that was a great black hole impression, by the way. But the reason we call it a black hole is because it is so strong, the gravity of it, that even light, which weighs nothing, even light can't escape a black hole. So the light flies into it, and instead of, you know, bouncing off, reflecting off, or flying around it, or something like that, where we can actually see the light, instead of that, the light goes towards the black hole, and then once it crosses the event horizon, it is doomed to, you know, spiral around the black hole and essentially get sucked into it. So anything past this event horizon to us appears black. But white holes are a theoretical counterpart to black holes, and they haven't been proven to exist or found in reality. But where black holes kind of suck everything in and expel nothing, white holes would expel everything and suck in nothing. So one of the theories is that a black hole actually kind of creates a wormhole, and this wormhole is, you know, maybe somewhere out in space, maybe in another dimension, maybe in another universe. I don't know. Space is insanely complicated. But the theory is that everything that flies into a black hole doesn't actually get destroyed, but just travels through the wormhole and then out the other end through this white hole. And that is basically the whole mystery. It's a very strange, mind-blowing concept. I mean, black holes are mind-blowing enough as it is. So white holes, you know, step that up a little bit. Space and physics is kind of equal parts insane, fascinating, beautiful, and also terrifying. But yeah, I'll be sure to update you guys if we ever do find actual evidence of white holes. The woman on the Road of Bones. So firstly, the Road of Bones is this road or route in Russia, named so because it was built on the bones of tens of thousands of prisoners and workers. You know, gulag prisoners who were forced to build this road back in the days of Stalin, and when they were worked to death, essentially, instead of burying them, whatever, they just threw them onto the road, built over them, and just continued. And so this was dubbed the road or route of bones. Pretty dark and terrifying, but this entry refers to the case of this woman who was seen walking along the road, and she was seen walking along for months along this route to apparently the destination of Magadan, which is a massively long journey to be walking along. And apparently when people came, they stopped by the side of the road to ask for help, or to ask her if she needed help. They offered her food, they offered her water, they offered her clothes, or to, give her a ride, or to give her warmth. And every single time, she just refused everything. Nobody knows who she was, where she came from, where she went, if she actually made the journey, or if she died along the way, or if she wasn't actually a person, because some of the theories say that she may have been a ghost of some kind, or a spirit, either of some woman who had died along the route, or saying she was the wife of a man who had died, and she was basically forever haunting this route. The Zanfretta aliens. So this is a case that I covered in my Ultimate Alien Iceberg, so check it out if you like that sort of thing. But this happened in Italy in 1978. And this happened when a night watchman named Pier Fortunato Zanfretta was guarding a villa at night when he suddenly saw a round red object just there. So he radioed his supervisor, who later attested that he heard Zanfretta screaming, on the other end of the radio. And when he went round there, Zanfretta was just collapsed on the floor. They woke him up and he said he saw what he described as these 3 large aliens. Or actually, an important detail is he didn't say aliens, he said creatures. But he said they had rumpled or fat skin, triangular eyes, and clawed feet. And when Zanfretta was asked if he was attacked by these men, Zanfretta said, "No, these were not men." Zanfretta then went on to be actually abducted multiple times over the next few years by these same apparent creatures, and under hypnosis started to reveal more and more about these abductions, about these encounters, about these creatures. Their mouths, he said, looked like they were made out of metal. They had these strange red veins on their heads. They had pointy ears, and they came from the 3rd galaxy, whatever that means. I don't even know where the 2nd galaxy is. So a bit of a strange encounter, but quite an interesting alien case, which, as I said before, if you like aliens, UFOs, all that sort of thing, absolutely check out the Alien and UFO Iceberg. Link in the description below. Oki Al-Kite is a case that we've already covered, and this was under the case of Robert Cooper, and it's basically exactly the same case. Robert Cooper was just the suspected culprit, Oki Al-Kite was the victim, but we'll briefly go over it again here. And Oki Al-Kite was this 53-year-old employee of this engineering firm, or engineering consulting firm technically, in Colorado, and he went missing in 2004. Now, when he went missing, he didn't turn up for work. His work and his family started to get a little bit concerned, so his family called the police, a search was started, and he was found there, tied up, beaten, tortured, and just left there. His phone and wallet weren't found anywhere. His ATM card was actually used a little later by this man, who was clearly wearing a ski mask and driving Oki's truck. And this is really where the big mystery was. Firstly, who killed Oki and why? Secondly, who was this mysterious man driving this truck, using Oki's bank card to withdraw money? Are these two the same men? Did Ski Mask Man kill Oki? And if they aren't the same man, that means there's multiple people involved, and I think that just adds even more to the mystery. And Oki himself was a very kind of down-to-earth, reasonable guy. He wasn't shady or dodgy or violent or aggressive. He didn't seem to have any enemies, especially enemies this extreme that would, kidnap, lock someone up, torture them, and then kill them. But this Ski Mask Man, he is thought to be the same man who rented a room from Oki, as according to witnesses, the man who rented this room was kind of quiet, kind of mysterious. He would always, he'd be talking to Oki face to face. Someone else would come into the house, come into the room, and he would always be like, kind of try and hide his face, try and make his identity as vague as possible without rousing too much suspicion. And so they looked into this man who had rented the room from Oki, and they found that all of his information that he gave to Oki was basically false. His address was false, it was made up. His name that he gave, Robert Cooper, was also made up. And so that's basically where the case ended. There are theories that say that this man, the Robert Cooper, was connected in some ways to the Turkish Hezbollah, just because some of the DNA found at the scene was linked not to an individual person, but to a kind of group of people, in the Balkan kind of east area. You know, you could argue it was vaguely Turkish. And some of the torture and killing techniques that were used on Oki have been known to be used by Turkish Hezbollah. So that's kind of the conclusion they came to, but they weren't really able to press the case or investigate it much further than that. Flight 980. So this was a flight in 1985 that was going from Paraguay to Miami. And while descending for its scheduled stopover in Bolivia, for some unknown reason, it crashed into the side of Mount Illimani 6,000 meters up, killing everyone on board. And this entire case, the entire investigation, just got weirder and weirder the more they investigated it. Firstly, the site where they crashed, Mount Illimani, wasn't on their scheduled route, and in all the communications they had had with the airplane, they never once mentioned being, you know, in trouble or being lost or changing their route for whatever reason. So that was a little strange. And just after this crash, there were efforts made to go up to the crash, to investigate it, to maybe retrieve things from the flight, maybe fuselage, maybe any evidence, maybe even the black box, which, for those who don't know, the black box of a plane is basically this little, basically indestructible box. You know, it can survive in all sorts of conditions, and it records both the cockpit communications, you know, what the pilots were talking about, etc., as well as all of the flight inputs. So it'll show, you know, if the pilot pulled back or turned this on or turned this off or whatever. So it's absolutely essential to, you know, recover these if you're investigating what happened on the plane. So because the flight was so high up, or the crash was so high up, there was trouble initially getting a group to actually go up there and investigate. The local government was kind of less than useful, we can say, in this. And so it actually took some American, you know, investigation, some American pressure to organize a group of local hikers, you know, very experienced mountaineers, and they went up there. They found this actual wreckage, but strangely, they said they found no bodies, no blood, no black box even, but they did find pieces of the plane, and strangely, they found what was described as millions of dollars worth of illegal smuggled goods. And one of these goods was these smuggled reptile skins. And then when they came down, they basically, you know, told everyone what they found, and they said in their expert opinion that this entire area was far too dangerous for anyone to go up and investigate in, at least until the dry season, so a few months after this. And we'll get into this statement just a little bit later, but fast forward to later on in the year, and Bolivia released a accident report, you know, of this crash, of this incident, and strangely enough, in the report, they determined that the crash site was basically fully inaccessible, you know, even though these local climbers had originally gone up there. And in the report, they also made no mention of all of the illegal smuggled goods. And it seemed very much like they were trying to, for some reason, sweep something under the rug. They concluded that this was a controlled flight into the mountains, but had no real further explanation about what the pilots were doing, why they made this mistake, etc. And interestingly enough, as I said in the report, the area was said or deemed to be inaccessible, even though a single man named Ramon Valdez, he went up there. You know, he actually managed to make the hike, make the climb. He had obviously a bunch of local helpers, but this kind of proved that the site was far from inaccessible. You know, if a single man could do it, then surely some crew, some government-funded crew would be able to get up there and investigate. But as I said, he managed to actually get up there. He dug around a bit. He took some photographs. He took some videos. And so it seems strange that the Bolivian government wouldn't want to go up there. The airline that this flight belonged to, Eastern Airlines, was often implicated in these smuggling operations, you know, from various places in South America into especially Miami, with their planes and employees being implicated in these as well. And obviously a lot of these smuggled items could range from stuff like devil's snow, you know, or substances of that kind, to what the initial hikers found, that being illegal reptile skins, which might add more kind of context. It might make sense why the Bolivian government was kind of trying to cover this up, as a bunch of South American countries were kind of implicated in stuff like this. So maybe Bolivia didn't want this kind of pinned on them, you know. And if you are the cartel or whoever was smuggling these into Miami, it wouldn't really be that hard to go to some of these higher ups in Bolivia, you know, bribe them with a few $1,000s and say, look, just just brush this investigation under the rug. We don't want too many cameras here. We don't want too much detail here. And so I think that is a very good theory as to what might have happened with this. And also, as I mentioned before, when one of the original hikers came down from the mountain, he said that in his professional opinion, no one else should attempt this climb until the dry season. But we later found out that he was actually told to say this by someone in the Bolivian government, even though he later came forward and said in his opinion, you know, it would have been fine to climb it. I mean, he climbed it. It seems like the Bolivian government was trying to cover it up, but as to why the flight actually crashed, we still really have no idea. There were earlier reports of this wreckage falling from the sky, which was a fair distance really from where the plane crashed, which that is for the most part unexplained. Some theories say that the plane was flying along, it was shot at either with bullets or a missile or something, which blew part of the plane off, which, you know, might explain the wreckage that fell down over here. And then, since it wasn't a completely destructive injury on the plane, maybe it just continued to fly and fly and fly along until it eventually, you know, tried to steer itself and maybe crashed into the side of this mountain. Or some theories say that this wasn't intentionally brought down, that it was simply a navigational error. You know, they confused the kind of snow for the clouds for the sky and then just ended up, for whatever reason, crashing into it. And so yeah, it is a crazy case. You know, you could probably make a film out of this. It's got explosions, bribery, threats, secret government cover-ups, strange mysteries, strange characters, and all round just a very strange and mysterious case. And that is all we have time for. I really hope you enjoyed the 8th tier of the Unsolved Mystery Iceberg. Feel free to check out each new video as they're released, or just wait for these tier videos. And if you'd like to watch or recap on every mystery covered so far, there is a full playlist down in the description below, ready for you to watch to your heart's content. Let me know what you think about the new background, and as always, thanks for watching.